Chapter 454. You want to enter our treasure vaults? Arthur's lip twitched as he looked toward Lionel. What kind of king would allow someone not even of their kingdom to randomly enter their vaults and choose as they please? Even if one was a loyal citizen, it might only be possible to enter once every several years to pick out one or two things. Yet, not only was Lionel asking for free rein to do as he pleased, he wasn't even a person of Camelot. Despite this, Arthur felt like he couldn't say no. Maybe aside from him and a few founding members of Camelot, Lionel had done more for the kingdom than anyone else. And beyond that, Lionel was the reason he felt happier now than he had in a very long time. He had even managed to have dinner with his daughter just last night. Of course, Arthur didn't say these things aloud. After all, he had just lost a fifth of his kingdom and was in line to lose much more of it before all of this was over. Plus, many of his citizens were in danger. But after making his decision, he had already been ready to lose everything. So, how much of a need was there for him to care about such a loss? Yes. Lionel smiled and nodded as though it wasn't a big deal. Are you trying to extort me, kid? Exactly. PFT, King Arthur's head snapped in a particular direction. But by the time he locked eyes on his son, Lionel was already looking off into the distance as though nothing had happened. Nice weather we're having, huh? Lionel rubbed his nose, scanning the room. Unfortunately for his act, the only window in the throne room was exceptionally high up and was angled such that it only shone a small light on the throne itself. So, how could he possibly know with any sort of detail the kind of weather they were having? King Arthur shook his head. Lionel had always been so obedient. He couldn't help but feel that Lionel was having a bad influence on his son. At this point, Lionel's smile faded somewhat and he became more serious. Arthur, I've told him this already, but you should be aware as well. If you don't want to lose too much of your power after submitting to the Empire, what's important is to show your worth. Repelling this invasion is a great opportunity for you. Since Terrain dares to do this, they're confident. I'm certain that they've scouted out Earth and understand more about our world than even maybe we do. The Empire will definitely be in trouble and Terrain definitely won't stop until they claim the world for themselves. The greatest variable in this war is you all, Camelot and the Demon Empire. Terrain? King Arthur raised an eyebrow. You seem to know a lot about these enemies? Not a lot, just more than most. And you believe that by opening up the vaults to you our likelihood of winning will be greater? Exponentially so. And how am I supposed to make certain that you aren't embezzling anything? Lionel blinked and smiled once more. You don't. Just take it as my worker's fee. Shameless. These are your vaults. Lionel raised his brows in surprise. Lionel smiled. Yes, this should be the greatest treasure store on Camelot. The only rival to us might be Big Sister's empire. The area was much larger than anything he expected. The vaults were located on the basement floor of the castle. And, despite the size of the castle itself, it took up several floors, a whole 3 levels to be exact. The amount of space totaled up to more than a square kilometer. It was absolutely inconceivable that there would actually be enough treasure to fill it all up with. The first floor was filled with stacks of gold coins. Lionel felt as though he had walked into a dragon's den. He was certain that just the existence of this place was a huge hazard. If one of these gold piles slipped, it could easily bury someone alive. Still, Lionel wasn't very interested in these piles of gold. On Earth, gold had lost its value a long time ago. Other than being a good conductor, it wasn't very useful otherwise. It was too soft of a metal and not very good for weapons or armors. It was unfortunate for Camelot, but it seemed that in any places other than their kingdom, this first floor of treasures was quite useless. However, there were 2 more floors below this one. Lionel didn't know what to say for a long time. The store of ores seemed endless. They piled up into what seemed like perpetuity. Though most were pseudo-4th-dimensional ores, their value was so much greater than the gold on the first level that they couldn't even be properly compared. It felt like blasphemy to do so. And here Lionel thought he was somewhat of a tycoon after mining the hive, only to find out that he was still very much a poor man if he was comparing himself to a true kingdom. But this made sense. Camelot had existed as a pseudo-4th-dimensional world for a very long time. Over the years, it only made sense that they would gather so many precious ores. Even if there was nothing else, Lionel felt that he could create so much with just what was before him. He saw several mountainous piles of herb or countless types of vein and elemental ores. He even saw some true 4th-dimensional ores hidden within that might have slipped through the cracks. Yet, there was still one more floor. As shocked as Lionel was on the second, the third floored him. He finally bowed down. He was indeed a poor man. He apologized for ever believing that he was wealthy. No matter where he looked, there were endless mountainous piles of fourth-dimensional ores. If the gold piles could have buried a normal human, these could bury even Lancelot and King Arthur. Seeing such a sight, Lionel thought that King Arthur was too stingy for even hesitating to say yes to him. Even if he wanted to take and use it all, would he even be able to? But at the same time Lionel was shocked. Just how did a pseudo-fourth-dimensional world like this produce so many fourth-dimensional metals? There even seemed to be more of them than there was on the second level? How did that even make any sense? It was safe to say that any guilt Lionel would have felt taking advantage of Camelot like this flew out the window. Chapter 455. How did you gather so much? Lionel finally asked Leonis. These? Leonis started. This room didn't used to be so full. It got like this after the Merlin trials collapsed. Lionel's eyes widened. You mean? These used to be rewards you could spend skill points to buy. But after the trials collapsed they were all collected up by us. Lionel was speechless. Back then he had been mostly worried about gathering up the core of the trial world. Since he was taking it, he felt it would be too shameless to take anything else, so he only accepted the goddess necklace after Krakos brought it to him personally. But he hadn't expected that he had really missed out on so much. Now that Lionel thought about it, when he was within the trials, he had been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of items within the special store. So, instead of scrolling through all of them one by one, he used his voice to filter for what he wanted to look for. In that situation he didn't really have time to leisurely scroll through the store, so he always filtered using his voice. Due to this, he didn't have a proper understanding of the scope of items that could be found within the special store. I was too nice, Lionel thought to himself. Lionel shook his head. Most of the ores he saw here were tier 1 to 3 black grade ores. This put them at the lower levels of the fourth dimension. But the sheer volume might very well be beyond anything even the Empire had managed to gather to this point. Of course, Lionel couldn't confirm this with any sort of certainty, but he felt that he likely wasn't too far off with his assessment. My divine armor. If I can... Lionel slowly shook his head. He didn't feel he was skilled enough to complete his divine armor just yet, not to mention the fact he hadn't even decided just what kind of divine armor to build. Still, if there was ever a place to train, this would be it. And there was likely no better place for Lionel to find the resources he needed to build it. Wait. Lionel's gaze swept through the massive treasure house. At that moment he suddenly shot forward, stunning Leonis who had been by his side. Wait for me. Leonis ran after Lionel. Leonis had unfortunately yet to reach the peak of the third dimension, so he hadn't broken through like his father, mother, sister and the others. So he was obviously no match for Lionel in speed. Luckily this storehouse was only a few hundred meters in length and width. Even though Lionel was much faster he couldn't go very far to begin with. Leonis found Lionel amidst a pile of ores, his hand pressed flush against its side. Be careful if it falls over. Lionel nodded, acknowledging Leonis' worries. If he died beneath a pile of precious ores he had just been greedily eyeing, wouldn't that be too pathetic? The pile suddenly shifted, causing Leonis' heart to seize. But Lionel didn't panic. Soon, as though by magic, the pile separated, revealing a radiant piece of Oregon. Lionel grabbed onto the ore as the rest of the pile settled down. Only then did Leonis feel his heart calm down once again. He had forgotten that Lionel was a variant earth mage. Something like this was within his abilities. But the level of control that was needed was beyond Leonis' imagining. Leonis shook his head and looked curiously at the shimmering black ore in Lionel's hands. You recognize this ore? Leonis asked, somewhat curious. Though they had brought all of these ores here, the truth was that they had yet to research most of their functions. In this aspect they were still very much in the dark compared to others. Usually the Merlin trials would have a short explanation of what the ore was before they chose it. But obviously with it collapsed it couldn't provide such functionality. This? I recognize all the ores. Lionel said with a smile. This one is black herb ore. It's a foundational type metal used as a fusion agent in crafts. It works almost like iron in that it has a base type that can be forged into all sorts of chemical structures depending on your approach and technique. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say it was the most important ore in the entire universe. This one is special though because it was on the verge of becoming bronze herb ore before it was mined from its core. So the ore essence within it is a margin purer than regular black herb Oregon. This ore might be able to help me clear a final hurdle in my metal body. Leonis' brows raised in surprise. It wasn't because of Lionel's detailed explanation, but rather because Lionel said he recognized all of these ores. Even though Leonis wasn't educated on the topic, He could easily tell that there were hundreds of types of ores in this room, each with their own unique variations. To be able to recognize them all would take an absolute expert. Lionel took a deep breath. First, I need to organize this room. There's no order to anything. Lionel always liked things to be neat and tidy. This was why his room was always meticulously kept after, though he cared less about his own appearance. It was just a quirk of his. He had the compulsion to organize these ores by type and ability. It would make what he wanted to do next much more efficient. Things may get a bit wild, Leonis. Stay close to me if you'd like to remain here. Leonis nodded and then shook his head. It's fine. I have a feeling this will take a long time, no need for me to continuously be looking over your shoulder. Leonis chuckled. If you need anything else, just let me know. There will be another council gathering soon to strategize defensive measures. We also can't be certain of the Empire's plans now and if they've changed. Lionel nodded in acknowledgement. He didn't expect everyone to base plans around him to begin with. It may very well be possible that Arthur wasn't too optimistic about him from the beginning. In the end, he was just a single third-dimensional being. How much change could he really cause? At the moment, it was very likely that all the forts in the capital were being attacked. If Lionel wanted to swing his weight around, he would need more. Lionel could already sense that there was the evolution ore he had been looking for so long hidden in these piles. It was just unfortunately more difficult to reach. There was no doubt that this evolution ore was the most important centerpiece of his divine armor, and there was just enough of it to form the 3 portions of essence he needed. Lionel's gaze sharpened as he looked around. This would be his battlefield. Chapter 456. The instant Leonis had left the range, the treasure vault became a violent storm of swirling ores. Lionel sat at the very center of it all, in silent meditation. Ores swooped inches from his body at speeds that surpassed a bullet, yet he didn't flinch. How could he? They were all in his control to begin with. If others were watching on, they would find that the disorganized store of ores was very quickly tending toward disorganized order. Then from there, it very quickly became completely tidy. Beads of sweat fell down Lionel's brow. Without a choice, he activated his bronze runes. This instantaneously made the control of the metals around him several times easier, even to the point that the speed they whizzed around the room with even accelerated. It should have been impossible for Lionel to control so many ores at once. At the very least, he shouldn't have been able to guarantee that they didn't crash into each other. After all, Lionel could split his mind more than a dozen ways, but it definitely wasn't to the point of being able to do so hundreds of ways. Rather, Lionel used a much cleverer method. He drew a map of the treasure stores in his dream world, rebuilding a 3-dimensional construct. Then he color-coded pathways for the ores to follow, ensuring that these pathways rarely, if ever, crossed. Almost as though he was playing a game, Lionel sorted these ores one after another. This way, all he had to do was focus on ensuring that the ores always stuck to these pathways, and it was not necessary for him to split his mind more than a dozen or so ways, each for a different kind of Oregon. Very quickly, Lionel spread out the ores, arranging them into neat rows with clean roads between them. The first division was in ore types. There was a section for foundational ores, veins ores, vessel ores, domain ores, and finally, the pile Lionel was most looking forward to, evolution ores. Foundational ores were over 70% made of herb ores. Other foundational ores simply weren't as common or as useful. They had very specific use cases that made them almost useless. And oftentimes their functions could be accomplished by herb or to an even better degree. So, other foundational ores were only used in rare instances. The only foundational ore that made Lionel take a pause while observing it was lava rhombus Oregon. It had only one functional use case, the fusion of earth and fire type ores. When hearing this, one can understand why such foundational ores were looked down upon. For one, earth and fire weren't opposing elements, herb or could allow their fusion easily, there was simply no need for this special use case. However, Lionel, for obvious reasons, was intrigued. While herb or could be used in every use case, it also required a high level of skill. Knowing exactly how to temper the ore to receive the desired effect was the bane of many force crafters. These unique foundation ores, however, could be used in complex constructs to make them far simpler. After separating out these 5 major categories, the rest was obviously down to the elements and other unique cases like soul-type ores. Once Lionel was finished, he looked back toward the smallest pile. Of course, this held the evolution ores. There were actually enough for 13 portions of essence. If Lionel combined this with the 7 he already had, this meant that he could form 2 complete portions of bronze evolution ore. One had to remember that 10 black evolution ores could form a bronze evolution ore and that 100 bronze evolution ores could form a silver one. Evolution ores had two abilities. The first was fusing two ores into a unique or never-before-seen. And its second ability was to evolve in or to the next level. A black evolution ore could evolve a third-dimensional or into the fourth, while a bronze evolution ore could evolve a fourth-dimensional or into the fifth. According to the speculations of Lionel's father, if one formed their divine armor's core with 10 black evolution ores, it was theoretically possible to form a quasi-fifth-dimensional divine armor while still being within the fourth dimension. Lionel thought back to the quasi-bronze grade ore he had found within the hive, warping domain Oregon. If he made it the core of his divine armor, wouldn't he be able to cross that barrier and stand firmly within the fifth dimension? Even if he couldn't, the effects would be so infinitely close to the fifth dimension that nothing within the fourth dimension would be able to withstand its impact. Of course, this wouldn't be in terms of strength but rather in terms of function. Though Lionel hadn't settled on the design of his divine armor, the one thing he knew for certain was that his warping domain ore would be the centerpiece of it all. Warping ore was able to create an independent space that could make even a single step feel like an entire mile. Due to this, it was quite well known for its defensive abilities, but as Lionel learned more about domains, he felt that they were far more flexible than this. The uses of domain were as variable as the uses of an ability. It depended on a person's creativity to use it properly. Now that Lionel had this entire warehouse of ores available to him, the picture of his divine armor came into view. Rather than focusing on attack, defense, or elemental types, his plan would be very simple. He would maximize his own speed while ensuring his enemies felt as though taking even a single step was almost impossible. As Lionel looked through the various ores, he felt a picture becoming clearer and clearer in his mind. And the center of it all would be his warping domain Oregon. However, whether he would be able to accomplish the aspirations forming in his mind would depend on if he could build up the skill he needed. While he had many types of ores around him, there was just a single warping domain Oregon. Spatial type treasures were too rare, even to the point there were less than a dozen in this entire treasure store, and only 2 of which could match up to warping domain or in value. In that case, let's give this tiger wings. Lionel's gaze blazed. Maybe even Terrain could have never been aware that their greatest enemy would come in the form of a young man sitting cross-legged on the floor of a vast treasure vault. Chapter 457. Eat slowly, little Tali, slowly now. Lionel wiped off sweat that threatened to sting his eyes once more. He never forgot that one of the hazards he learned about metal spirits was their propensity to overeat. If he let it happen, Tolliver could go mad and harm him. This was the main reason Tolliver had yet to evolve into the fourth dimension along with Blackstar. Lionel was very careful about how much he fed him and what he fed him. Lionel preferred to give the little fella high-quality ores that would fill him very quickly. This was much better than feeding Tolliver a lot of low-quality ores. The more high-quality ores Tolliver ate, the more powerful the little guy would become in relation to its evolution stage. So, Lionel took this very seriously. Oh! Tolliver suddenly shot out of Lionel's gloved hands. The little guy's body concentrated into a single point before explosively growing. Lionel realized that this was a sign that little Tali was finally crossing into the fourth-dimensional realms. Lionel's mind had already entered such a realm, so he was very confident that he would still be able to control and command Tolliver appropriately. Tolliver came back to Lionel looking just that much more lustrous. Ready to work, little guy? Bloop bloop. Lionel smiled lightly before his expression suddenly changed. He quickly commanded little Tolliver to float in the air as he scanned his black gloves. After just a moment, he smiled bitterly, watching it corrode as though having been dipped in strong acid. Lionel sighed, peeling the gloves off of his hands before it got worse. He didn't have replacement gloves. And though he felt he might be able to make them, how would he? He needed gloves to craft with little Tolliver but couldn't make the gloves he needed to craft with Tolliver, without little Tolliver. Lionel grit his teeth. I've been avoiding this training for a long time. No time better than the present. One of the last lessons of his father's beginner's guide was to begin to stray away from gloves. The stronger a metal spirit became, the more elaborate a force crafter's gloves became. Eventually they would become a hindrance to hand speed and coordination. Honestly, Lionel thought his dad was a madman. As if calling himself Father Overlord wasn't bad enough, the old man actually wanted to kill him. Lionel took a deep breath and activated his bronze runes once again, thinking back to the words his father had spoken. You are a moralist, the earth bows down to you, not the other way around. Gloves are for cowards? It made Lionel wonder why his father put a hazard section in the dictionary at all. First it was forming a fifth-dimensional divine armor, and now it was force crafting without protection. Lionel couldn't help but feel that his old man was simply too irresponsible. Lionel brought out the first catapult, steadying his beating heart. With a flip of his palm, a familiar chain necklace appeared in Lionel's hand. Fine cracks spread across its surface, causing a flicker of rage to appear in Lionel's heart. This chain necklace was the very first quasi-bronze treasure Lionel ever possessed. Unfortunately, due to Miles almost blowing him to smithereens, it was heavily damaged. The truth of the matter was that it should have been impossible for explosives of the 21st century like Miles used back then to damage a near fifth-dimensional treasure. The main issue is that this was an energy-based treasure. As a result, it had to rely on the force around it in order to form its defensive shields. This was exactly why it stopped working when Lionel was under the influence of the force disruption towers. Simply put, this chain necklace was using third-dimensional force to protect itself and as a result was far weaker than it should have been. If it was using fourth-dimensional force, it would likely take at least 24th-century explosives and technology to damage it to this extent. That was right. At full strength, this chain necklace could survive several blows from the crossbows that White Knight Dior couldn't survive 2 strikes of. This was the power of quasi-bronze treasures. This was their true value. It was just a shame that this chain necklace was damaged. For now, that is. This was Lionel's first test for himself. If he wanted to gain enough skill to build his divine armor, he would need to build up his skill just as quickly as he built up his strength within Brave City. The only way he could protect himself, his friends and Aina would be if he had the strength to do so, and this was his fastest path toward that end. Lionel smiled lightly. If I have my divine armor, I won't need this. In that case, it'll combine both necklaces into one. This should be a good birthday present. Lionel took out the Treading Goddess necklace. His mind spun with thoughts. He wanted to combine 3 abilities into one. First, the defensive abilities of the chain necklace, the teleportation abilities of the Treading Goddess necklace, and finally, add something on the end to give Aina a sensory boost. After half an hour of meditation, his gaze grew cold and calculating. He outstretched a hand and allowed little Tali to land in his bare palm. Lionel hadn't been wrong. Earth was in shambles, facing battles on all fronts. All 8 forts and even the capital was under siege. The only difference was that the capital was under siege by 2 cities with the moon, Camelot, and the 8 forts only being under siege by 1 each. However, surprisingly at this moment, the Emperor of Earth sat in his garden, the delicate chirping of birds around him. He continued to meditate, raising a cup of tea to his mouth without opening his eyes. He listened intently to a report, not showing any particular reaction. That should be all, Imperial Grandfather. This is the current situation of the Camelot satellite. Emperor Fox nodded his head. You may go. Noah hesitated. Was that all his grandfather wanted to tell him? Where were the orders? Should he continue to try and assimilate Camelot and the Demon Empire? Or should he focus on wiping out White City? Grandfather? Is there something else? Emperor Fox let out a deep sigh, his eyes opening to reveal 2 piercing emerald gems. It felt as though he had the whole world within his purview. Noah, you've grown too reliant on me. Noah didn't know what to say. He stared at the talisman in his hand at a complete loss. Did you know that your cousin is on that satellite right now? Noah's expression changed. The very same White Knights you came to report to me about, he's already killed one. He didn't have an army, he didn't have support, he only had himself. Noah's heart seized. How was that possible? Do not contact me again until White City is nothing but flat earth. Chapter 458. Noah placed the talisman down, a small hint of shock on his face. Still, it only took him a moment for him to regain his calm. Noah didn't know what his grandfather's ability was. In fact, he was certain that no one knew. Emperor Fox was a man who always kept his cards close to his chest. Even his closest advisors might not know everything he was thinking about. But this was the way of an emperor. To remain so calm even in the face of everything you and your ancestors had built potentially burning down. This was the marker of a true ruler. That said, Noah wasn't so certain that this was all about calmness. He always got the sense that his grandfather wasn't calm but rather, confident. It was a subtle difference that was hard to grasp but even harder to fake. However, as the prince of the empire, Noah knew the situation well. And, quite frankly, there was simply nothing to be confident about. Earth was caught completely unprepared. This wasn't a failure of Emperor Fox and the royal family, but rather simply due to circumstances. Who could have predicted the appearance of Camelot? And who could have predicted that a second acceleration would occur right after the first? In truth, Camelot should have been a variable terrain couldn't prepare for. But, due to the circumstances, it became a saving grace for them instead. What would you like to do? Jessica interrupted Noah's thoughts. Maybe only she was allowed to listen in on a conversation between the Emperor and a prince. Noah tapped on the large table before him, his thoughts running wild. He wasn't very sure how he felt about his cousin. He didn't hate nor love Lionel, he was about as neutral on the topic as one could get. At the same time, he could also tell that his grandfather wasn't overly eager to bring Lionel back to the palace either. Though it was said like this wasn't to say that Emperor Fox didn't want anything to do with Lionel. If that was the case, he wouldn't praise him so much. Rather, the main point was that the Emperor was content to watch Lionel spread his wings out from afar. According to the information we have, there's a great possibility that he is within Camelot at the moment. The dead white knight that His Imperial Majesty mentioned should have fallen before the attack on the First Barony. That attack occurred within 20 to 30 kilometers of Camelot. This coupled with the fact reports say that Prince Lionel was a part of the zone trial that brought Camelot here, and this is the most appropriate conclusion. Noah nodded noncommittedly. How do you think he managed it? Noah couldn't help but ask after a while. Jessica didn't respond. She had been with Noah long enough to know that whenever he asked questions he knew they didn't have enough information to answer, that he didn't really expect one. Noah was usually a meticulous, hard-nosed, and between-the-lines kind of person. The only moments he acted like this was after he finished speaking with his grandfather. He didn't even seem to have the same aura about him anymore. Noah stood, his calm returning in full. It seems that Imperial Grandfather was correct. There are many eyeing our Earth, and some of them might even still be lurking in the shadows even now. Maybe it's time we show them that we aren't pushovers. Noah walked to the side of his military tent. Located on what would have been a wall, there was a weapons rack, but it was filled with nothing but sabers. However, shockingly enough, each and every one of these sabers were as large as a human body, carrying blades that seemed capable of cleaving a mountain in two. Despite their heft, Noah picked up the first with a single arm. Its radiant blue blade reflected beneath the dim flickering lights. It seemed to exude a magic aura. This one will do. With a flip of his palm, the saber vanished and Noah walked to the entrance of his tent. Jessica, all the preparations you made for the Demon Empire, forget them for now. We have a city to level. Jessica nodded. According to their intelligence, the Demon Empire had allied with Camelot and planned to submit to the Empire. With this sudden change, their thoughts might turn from submission to thoughts of taking advantage of the Empire in their time of weakness to maintain their own sovereignty. In that case, rather than giving them a hollow show of power for mere negotiations, they'd show them a real one. Within Camelot's treasure vaults, Lionel had no idea that his grandfather was aware of his presence already. In fact, he wasn't even aware that he had a grandfather to begin with. In Lionel's mind, his only family was his father and his missing mother. But, maybe even if he was aware, he wouldn't have the mind to think about it. Lionel sat on the ground, beads of sweat falling down his face. If one stopped focusing on his visage and focused on his hands, it would be possible to see a ghastly sight without compare. Blood dripped from Lionel's hands, ricocheting off the ground and echoing through the vast vault. Little Tali happily swam around Lionel's fingers, not realizing the damage it was causing. But, Lionel couldn't blame the little guy. Despite having evolved into the fourth dimension, it was still nothing but a toddler. In fact, the little guy hadn't even really begun to form cohesive thoughts of its own. Though Lionel could command Blackstar with words, little Tali didn't accept such direction well. Lionel had to use a series of images for Tolliver to understand his meaning. However, understanding didn't make it any less painful. There was good news and bad news. The bad news was that it was almost impossible to suffer such pain and focus on crafting at the same time. How could one maintain a steady connection and complete such intricate actions when it felt like the world was collapsing around them? The good news, however, was that Lionel managed to evolve under pressure and create a new ability. He called the ability Dream Sense. Since it was so hard to feel such pain and focus at the same time, why do so at all? Dream Sense allowed Lionel to split his senses the exact same way he split his mind. It was just an extension of his Dream Clone ability. Lionel used Dream Sense to split his mind two ways. One tackled the brunt of the pain he was feeling while the second focused entirely on his crafting. It was on the third day of using this ability that Lionel evolved once more. He realized something incredibly important. If he could split his senses to help him focus, why not split his sensory pain between several minds? If he did that, wouldn't this allow him to dull his pain by several factors? If he split the same pain between 10 minds, wouldn't he reduce his own pain by a factor of 10? This realization truly opened Lionel up to a new world. If he could control his mind even down to this minute level, just what other possible abilities could his creativity have in store for him? Chapter 459. After grasping an initial mastery of dream sense, Lionel realized just how much freedom he had in this regard. While he could diverge his senses by separating his mind, if he instead chose to layer and concentrate his senses instead, he could cause a convergent response instead. In the end, this meant that Lionel was suddenly capable of both dulling and magnifying his senses by several times, all of which was limited by the number of dream clones he could form. On the surface, this wasn't very important, but the applications Lionel could think of were practically endless. For one, if Lionel had the ability to dull his pain in this fashion, he wouldn't have struggled nearly as much to open the 9th door of his metal synergy lineage factor. By extension, if Lionel applied his higher pain threshold to other training methods, he could force his body to withstand much more than it previously could. Though the idea of suffering through pain and tempering one's willpower sounded nice, this was something that could only appear in fantasy novels. The human body had strict limits on the pain it could withstand for a reason. Going beyond these limits often meant the shutting down of one's body regardless of how much willpower you had. Pushing past these limits was often impossible, not for lack of willpower but simply due to lack of feasibility. At the same time, however, these thresholds were often lower than they could be. This made sense. If one's body only shut down when at the very edge of breaking down, it might no longer be possible to pull back. But, like this, Lionel would be able to use his own senses to look for his Bodis breaking point and choose a safe point to stop before then. This ultimately gave Lionel far more control over his own body. Still, the applications of this were far beyond just dulling pain. If Lionel applied this skill to his internal sight, for example, he could make it several times more sensitive than it had been in the past. This could not only make his calculations more detailed and accurate, it would also be almost impossible for someone to slip by his senses. Applied in this way, Lionel could layer his vision to gain more details in a single look. He could layer his sense of touch to make his fingers more sensitive during force crafting. He could even layer his sense of taste to make food tastier if he so chose to. The potential applications were almost endless. When Lionel realized this, his mind seemed to implode. It wasn't with pain, but rather felt as though a door had been thrust open to him. Lionel sent all his focus into his arms, first separating his mind to control them independently, then layering them once again to multiply the same control. The instant he finished this, his finger's speed hitched for a moment before it felt as though they broke past a barrier. His movements became smoother and more fluid, his control over little Tali reaching unprecedented heights. This is it. Superior Grade 1 designation. Lionel's hand coordination and speed had been stuck at Advanced Grade 1 designation for a long time. Thanks to his metal synergy lineage factor, he was effectively as good as someone who had already stepped into Superior Grade 1 designation, but it hadn't been a true breakthrough just yet, until just now. Looking down at his bloodied hands, orchestrating the movements of thin lines of silver like a conductor guiding a voluminous sonata, he couldn't help but laugh. This feeling, he had never expected it to feel so good. Lionel's confidence shot through the roof. He finally felt as though his body could keep up with his mind. It was almost as though his own body had become one of his familiars as well. He controlled it no differently than he took control of little Tali and little Blackstar. The two necklaces before Lionel seemed to magically and seamlessly fuse into two. In the blink of an eye, Lionel completed a task he had spent several days on. The treading goddess necklace became more resplendent, exuding a silvery aura. Without looking to the side, Lionel locked onto a soul type ore from the vein and vessel piles. Lionel had already long since picked these two ores out. If he wanted to give this necklace a sensory boost, this was the only way. The vessel ore was known as Ghost Whispering Oregon. It had the ability to continuously absorb and purify force into soul force. It was born in places with exceptionally dark energy, and due to this ability to create soul force, it became known as the Ghost Oregon. The vein ore was known as Soul Pulsing Oregon. When fed an appropriate amount of soul force, it had the ability to amplify it. But what made it so useful was the fact it was able to resonate with whoever marked it, thus effectively become an extension of this person's own soul force. Due to this ore's sensitivity to souls and their resonance, it gave whoever fused with it an equally great sensitivity to the resonance of other souls in proportion to how much soul force it was provided with. When these two ores came together, the results were exponentially greater. By Lionel's previous estimates, it would have taken him at least a week to finish the integration of these two ores without disrupting the balance of the remainder of the treasure. After all, the more moving parts a treasure had, the more complex it was and the more difficult it was to succeed in crafting. Yet, Lionel now felt a confidence he never had before. He felt as though the entire world was in his hands. The communication between one's brain and their body was a limiting factor to everyone. This was why endless training was necessary to break down the body and force it to understand the tasks the brain wanted it to complete. But, for the current Lionel, at least within certain limitations, he could control his body to the finest detail on the very first try. All of his mental prowess was concentrated into his hands. As though each joint had become a node to be controlled at his whim, he took hold of his own body like it was a puppet on strings. Bend to my will. Chapter 460. Lionel's right hand moved like the wind, wrapping around the ghost whispering Oregon. At the same time, his left shot toward the soul pulsing or working with complete independence. Leon's gaze stared out into blank space. It was as though his mind was completely wiped. It even felt like his eyes might roll back into their sockets at any moment. Yet the speed of his hands didn't slow in the slightest. Lionel's right hand rapidly tapped at the ghost whispering Oregon. Little Tali raced across its surface, causing it to spin rapidly and heat up even faster. Smoky impurities flew into the air and dripped down from the green Oregon. It shrunk at a speed visible to the naked eye, falling from the size of a palm to the width of just a few fingernails. Lionel's left didn't stop. It stretched out at odd angles, causing little Tali to spread across the soul pulsing ore's surface. Very quickly, the red soul pulsing ore became an incredibly thin length of metal wrapped the entire way by little Tali's body. Yet, it seemed as though the thinness wasn't enough for Lionel as he continued to elongate the metal. From an ore of barely 2 inches thick, the soul pulsing ore became a thin line that stretched almost 5 meters. Finally satisfied, Lionel's left fingers twitched, causing the thin line to fold in on itself lengthwise, thus having it to just over 2 meters. To the naked eye, it seemed as though nothing had happened other than this. But, any sharp force crafters would be able to see that after folding it, Lionel used the added thickness he gained to roll the thin line into a thin tube. The ore ultimately became a fragile hollow tube that seemed capable of snapping in on its own weight at any moment. But what happened next was truly magical. Little Tali, who had wrapped itself around the thin tube at Lionel's command, suddenly began to move. At first it seemed as though the little guy was snapping the delicately constructed ore in half, but it soon became clear that this wasn't the case at all. Little Tali began to bend and contort into an intricate shape. The more time passed, the more complex the structure became and the smaller size it seemed to shrink to. It felt almost as though Lionel was constructing a miniature maze, hidden within the thin, gorgeous lines of the soul-pulsing Oregon. But the reality was that he was constructing something much more miraculous than that. In just an hour, the over 2-meter-long tube had been sculpted into a small spiderweb of structures with a width of no more than half an inch. From afar it looked like an oval gem. But up close one could see that it was a maze of delicately forged lines. As though by coincidence, the tempering of Lionel's ghost whispering ore concluded at the exact same time. By now, it looked like nothing more than a flowing blue liquid, having lost its green color during the purification process. Without a single pause, Lionel communicated with little Tolliver to bring the thin blue liquid forward. Then, as though he was a madman, he controlled it to pour over the delicate red structure he had just formed. One would think that with the heat difference, the red structure Lionel took so long to form was finished. The melting point of ghost whispering ore was simply far higher than that of soul pulsing ore, there shouldn't have been even a chance for it to survive. However, little Tali's body had yet to stop covering the delicate red structure. In 2 parts, Lionel both controlled little Tali to protect the delicate maze while on another hand controlling the blue liquid to pour over it. The blue substance wormed throughout the structure, sliding through impossibly small crevices with absolute ease. If other force crafters saw Lionel now, they would be stunned to the point of speechlessness. Such a process would usually be done in several steps. The easiest method would have been to split the structure into 2 molds before fusing them into one at the end. However, Lionel didn't take this approach at all despite it being the far easier option. The reason for this was quite intuitive. When using 2 molds, it would be impossible to avoid imperfections. The only way to guarantee a sublime result would be to complete the gem in a single step. But those who had the skill to do such things were simply too few. One had to remember that most would never even reach the advanced grade 1 designation, let alone the superior grade 1 designation. In addition, Those who could use metal spirits who were known for their ability to complete intricate crafts were even fewer. Lionel's vision regained his clarity and a sudden wave of fatigue slammed into him. His mind spun and he collapsed to the ground, the skin of his hands peeling and dripping with blood. Lionel sent a glance toward the newly reforged treading goddess necklace, a light smile creeping up on his lips. He modified it so that Aina could wear it as a headpiece again. It looked much less flashy than it did in the past, and the only exotic thing about it was the purple gem that hung from its center. But Lionel was greatly satisfied. He felt that his skill had reached a new level. Hey dictionary, scan this treasure for me. Asterisk ping asterisk. Treasure. Unnamed. Abilities. Minor teleportation. Instant teleportation within 3 meters once every 3 seconds. Has enough stores to save up for 2 charges. 4 skin. At full charge, capable of withstanding 3 strikes of a pseudo-fifth-dimensional entity. Sensory boost. Increased sensitivity and range of internal sight by a factor of 3. Grade. Elite Quasi-Bronze. Lionel grinned. This should be a good birthday present, right? Other than the fact that teleportation charges had fallen from 3 to 2 from the original Treading God's necklace, everything else was perfect. Lionel still remembered those emotions that ran through him when Miles and Simeon almost killed the 2 of them. Back then, he had greatly regretted not giving Aina the defensive treasure he had chosen for her earlier. Her birthday is just a few weeks away, he'll give it to her then. Lionel thought with a smile. After thinking this, Lionel became serious once more. Originally, he had expected it to take him at least a month to complete Aina's present. By the time he finished, he believed he would have the skill he needed to build the crafts he had in mind. But he never expected for him to have a breakthrough and ultimately take less than a month. But this was even better. Now he could begin immediately. Though his body was tired, Lionel's mind was still sharp. He felt an endless energy coming from his dream world. He felt as long as his mind was awake, the state of his body meant little. Grand heal. Lionel was showered with blinding light elemental force, the injuries to his hands repairing at impossible speeds. Let's start. Chapter 461. A knock sounded. Lionel? Aina? Ho-ho, feel free to ignore Big Sis if it's inconvenient too. Before Mordred could finish her words, the door to the room opened. Mordred's words were caught in her throat as she blinked speechlessly. Aina stood before her with an equally questioning glance. It had already been more than a week since they came here, but this was the first time someone had come to check on Aina. Well, aside from the usual delivery of food that came every so often. Camelot wasn't clear on Aina's strength, while King Arthur believed that Lionel wasn't quite strong enough to make a big difference either. Though King Arthur had battled and lost to Lionel before, those circumstances were quite special. Back then, due to his pride, he fell into Lionel's rhythm and tried to compete with him in speed casting. Objectively speaking, back then, if Lionel had to battle either Mordred or King Arthur, it would have been a difficult and long fight even after grasping the Winter Realm with his bow. This was how much strength these 2 legends had. Had King Arthur been more level-headed back then, Lionel wouldn't have been able to make such a fool out of him. This much should have been clear by the fact that, despite the optics of it all, Arthur came out of their battle completely unscathed. And now, King Arthur had finally crossed the barrier he had stalled at for so many years. This wasn't all either. Because now, the people of Camelot were considered to be people of Earth. As the world evolved, the people of Camelot, too, began to awaken to their own abilities. This was all to say that the King Arthur of now was by far and away stronger than the version of himself Lionel would have already struggled mightily to defeat. So, despite the fact that Lionel had grown since then as well, he was unlikely to last a few exchanges with the current King Arthur even now. So, it made sense that no one had come to communicate with Aina and Lionel. In their minds, what difference could these 2 children possibly make? The only person who knew that it was inadvisable to underestimate Lionel was Mordred, and this was because she knew everything about him, even secrets he had never exposed to another before. But, there was one interesting thing about that trial that Mordred hadn't told Lionel about. Back then, the first part of the trial was a test of sifting through information. It took some time for Lionel to realize that the main character of his trial was actually Mordred and not someone else. Mordred, of course, had to deal with this same issue. But, compared to Lionel, she had a much harder time deciphering the truth. This wasn't only because Lionel had an ability conducive to such analysis while she did not, but it was because it almost felt as though Lionel's life had not one, but 2 main characters to it. And the other character? It was exactly this young girl before her. When Mordred laid eyes on Aina, a welling of almost motherly sympathy burst out from her heart. You poor girl, you have to treat yourself better. Your scars have flared up again. Aina flinched when she heard these words and involuntarily took a step back. Unlike Lionel, who had been there, she wasn't aware why Mordred would somehow know so much about her. Saying that her scars had flared up would be a simple observation for anyone. But to say again so familiarly, why did it feel like Mordred knew this wasn't the first time this had happened? Aina's scars had, indeed, been inflamed once again. In fact, they had a raging violet redness to them that was even more severe than when Lionel had seen them at their worst. After using the cleansing waters, they had calmed and appeared like normal scars. Though they were still ever present, they looked like normal knife wounds. But now they looked like they had been infested by a nasty infection once again. Having seen almost as much of Aina's life as she had seen of Lionel's, Mordred knew well that Aina's scars only flared up like this when she used them to facilitate her training. Mordred sighed seeing Aina's reaction. She too felt that she was a bit too rash with her words. Aina had no idea that she had seen most of her life as well. "May I come in?" Mordred asked. By now, Mordred was certain that Lionel wasn't present. "Damn boy, how can you be so bad with women? She's clearly in a distressed state, yet you've gone off and disappeared." As much as Mordred knew about Aina's life, she knew even more about Lionel's. She knew how easily he detached himself. Whether it came to his mother or James, she didn't think that anything would change when it came to Aina either. Unfortunately, Lionel might have high emotional intelligence, but even he couldn't be perfect. He still had some things to learn, it seemed. Aina nodded. Mordred sighed. Come. Let's get you an ice pack. I'm sure that this can't feel very good." Aina wasn't sure why she allowed Mordred to enter, truthfully. Despite Mordred's talks of an ice pack, Aina never mentioned the fact Lionel's cleansing waters could likely heal her back to her previous state. I want to fight," Aina suddenly said. "Fight?" Mordred was stunned. "Yes, I want to join the battlefield. But I wasn't sure who to talk to, so I've been waiting here." Mordred hesitated. She was hoping to help Aina out a bit, maybe spend some time with the young girl. After all, if there was anyone who understood what it felt like to be alone, it was Mordred. But something about it made her realize that it was almost too difficult to say no to this girl. It looked as though if she said no, Aina would go off on her own to find her own battles. Thinking back to the scenes Mordred had seen of Aina's life, Mordred could only grit her teeth and agree. The last time that monster came out of her, she and Lionel were in that French zone. I need to be there if it happens again. Chapter 462. Though it might seem isolated, news of the war between Earth and Terrain spread like a wildfire throughout the universe. It could be said that a world wasn't truly considered to be a part of the dimensional verse until it entered the fourth dimension. But Earth in specific was wildly eyed by powerful entities due to its potential. It was exactly because of this that war between two mere fourth-dimensional worlds had suddenly become such a hot topic. The truth was that though Earth was favored, it was the world itself that was, not its people. Who cared which citizens populated it as long as the world existed? In fact, many other fourth-dimensional worlds were quite jealous of Terrain. The truth was that Terrain was the only fourth-dimensional world close enough to execute such a war plan. It wasn't by coincidence that Lionel and Aina could reach with a single talisman. These words peeled back the requirements for such an invasion to succeed. Firstly, two worlds had to exist on the same plane. It would be almost impossible for a fifth-dimensional world or above to accomplish such a thing. Or more accurately, the price they would need to pay to do this wouldn't be worth it. This was also why Terrain needed to wait until Earth evolved. The second requirement was closeness. The universe was too vast, it would be impossible for another fourth-dimensional world from a wildly different quadrant to even dream of attacking Earth. Terrain happened to meet both of these requirements, and now its actions were a hotly discussed topic. But, while most of the universe was just observing curiously, there was a group of people that was infuriated. The powers of Terrain. If there was one group of people that was completely caught off guard by this, even more than the people of Earth, it was these powers. In one moment they were negotiating terms to sell themselves to a higher power, and in the next moment, half the value of their world was plundered and taken. Who's going to explain to me how this happened? A thunderous roar shook Cliff's Edge Terrace. Stop all your yelling, is that going to get us anywhere? What did you say to me? Don't forget this is my territory, woman. Call me woman one more time and I'll peel your tongue out from your lips. Care to try me? Alright. This isn't getting us anywhere. You're only wasting more time. Tiske, we should have known they were planning something like this. It was obvious that they were planning something, but attacking Earth takes some balls. I didn't think that they'd have the guts to do it. 3 individuals gathered. The male with a booming voice was the head of Cliff's Edge Terrace, Head Solar. The woman was the head of Mirage Pavilion, Head Mirage. And the mediator of the two was the head of World's End Falls, Head Falls. That's exactly what doesn't make any sense. Who gave them the guts? Do they have any idea how many hidden allies Earth has? Do they have any idea how many other powers are eyeing Earth? Do they have a death wish? It seems like you're still the same idiot. Head Mirage sneered, her cherry lips parting in disdain. What did you say to me? Just think for a minute, blockhead. You think those people care about the people of Earth? Do you think there's such kindness in this world? The talents of Earth only come from those born on Earth. And even then, it isn't as though one can just go to a powerful world to birth a child and manifest a talent, or else everyone would do it. Obviously, the people of Earth are worth more than the people of our world even if we started popping out babies over there right this second. You idiot, do you think you're the only one that knows that? Since you're still not getting it, I'll try to speak extra slowly. Head Falls rubbed his temples and shook his head. But in the end, he couldn't be bothered to stop their bickering again. A first-generation child is a baby which doesn't have a single parent from the world. They will gain at most a 20% blessing from the world and won't be gifted with all of its potential. The remaining 80% will come from where the baby's parents originated. If the baby has at least one first-generation parent, they will receive 50% of the world's blessing and will be considered a second-generation child. This will be the same even if both parents are first-generation, the percentages will not change. If the baby has at least one second-generation parent, they will receive 80% of the world's blessing. Once again, this will be the same even if both parents are second-generation. If the baby has at least one third-generation parent, they will receive 90%. At fourth generation it will be 95%. And, with a parent at the fifth generation, the baby will finally be considered a full-blown native. It's at fourth generation where things change. At that stage, if both parents are fourth generation, then their baby will receive 100% of the world's blessing and also be considered a full native. Do you understand now? By this point, Head Solar wanted to explode. Did he look like a child? How could he not know these things? In fact, one of the most important things for a world to grasp after entering the fourth dimension and truly becoming a part of the dimensional verse was how to differentiate between immigrants and natives. There was no small number of people who wanted to take advantage of more talented worlds. In fact, even Terrain had to deal with this, let alone Earth. Do you really think I don't understand any of this? Clearly you don't. Head Mirage snapped. Our world is the only one in position to launch attacks from Earth for the foreseeable future. By the time any other worlds can come in and taste a piece of the pie, do you really think 5 generations wouldn't have passed by then? That's not even to mention the fact that there are plenty of 5th generation people on Earth right now. What's stopping them from being used like studs and sows? Het Solar froze. It seemed that this situation was far different from what he had imagined. Chapter 463. Het Solar calmed his rage and took a deep breath. So they're just taking a risk for a chance at survival? 5th dimensional worlds are much more common than 4th dimensional worlds. The number that would be in position to attack them is far more. Who's to say that with Earth's talent they'd even be able to establish themselves before they suffered the same fate? Though it was somewhat counterintuitive, after some thought it made more sense. It was best to consider the universe like a bell curve. It wasn't necessarily so that weaker worlds were more common. With the age of the dimensional verse, many worlds had had time to reach their potential. Due to the structure of things, the average talent of worlds was the 5th dimension. As such, the vast majority of worlds in the dimensional verse were within the 5th dimension. Likewise, the number of worlds within the 5th dimension that could attack Earth were likewise much more. If the cities won this war, how long would they get to enjoy it? A few decades at most? With Earth's potential, they likely wouldn't even need a century to cross yet another dimensional barrier. In fact, their situation is even worse than that. Het Solar sneered, suddenly thinking of something. Even if they really used Earth's people like sows and studs, it would take years for those children to mature. In the meantime, would they have the talent necessary to ensure that Earth wasn't swallowed by spacetime? Talent was a double-edged sword. Though better talents would be born in such a world, their zones were likewise more difficult and appeared more frequently as well. If those cities failed to clear the zones, Earth could very well be swallowed up. Het Falls sighed. Your words aren't wrong, but only partially. I'm sure you remember what happened in Brave City this time, right? Het Solar froze again. The heir of the Kafir family was accepted as a disciple of Valiant Heart Mountain. It's with this added layer of protection that they dare to do this. Het Solar frowned. But doesn't Earth have that Lionel child? He heard from his son that there was a Lionel character who was accepted without even having to go through the trials. Wasn't Lionel standing even higher than Anared's? How could this even count as protection? Yes, I've heard this as well. But this protection is only useful if two conditions are met. The first is that they have to be worlds that Valiant Heart Mountain can directly act against. Secondly, they have to have officially joined and have to have high standing. Not only has this Lionel child not officially joined, but Earth's attackers are members of the fourth dimension. This is not something Valiant Heart Mountain can interfere in. Het Solar sighed, slumping into his chair. Higher dimensional worlds couldn't interfere even if they wanted to. Not only would the price be high, but there were unspoken rules to think of. Wars between lower-level worlds were usually observed with one eye closed and another open by these behemoths. Only when the threats were of the fifth dimension would Valiant Heart Mountain begin to have some deterrence. They're banking on the Kiefer family heir joining in a few years and climbing up the disciple ranks? If only it were so simple. Het Falls sighed once again. I have reason to believe that the Kiefer family heir's success has little to do with what benefits Valiant Heart Mountain can provide and much more about what his fiancée's family can. At this point, even Het Mirage, who had long since grasped everything, sat up. What do you know? She asked straightforwardly. It's only my speculation. Just speak, stop beating about the bush. Het Solar pressed. They both knew about Het Fall's ability. If there were any deductions he could make, they would likely be very close to the truth. In reality, it was mostly because of this that they were caught off guard by things. They were so used to Het Falls seeing through everything in advance that they never even suspected what might happen. Now they had been caught with their pants down. Het Falls took a deep breath. The appearance of young Miss Era is too mysterious. No one knows where she comes from, what strength she possesses, or what her goals are. All we know is that she is the fiancée to the Kiefer family heir, nothing more, nothing less. I contacted Shield Cross Stars to hopefully find out some information about her, but my contacts weren't able to get anything back to me. The expression of the two heads changed. This realization didn't mean that Era's standing was above Shield Cross Stars. This was almost impossible. After all, Shield Cross Stars was considered to be the police of the universe. There were few if any powers that could ignore their influence. What this truly meant was that Het Fall's contacts weren't able to get him the information he needed. Simply put, their clearance wasn't high enough. This meant at least one thing for sure. Era wasn't from a world weaker than the fifth dimension. However, they did let slip one thing. According to them, a notice for fugitives was put out. Suspicious entities in all fourth-dimensional worlds within the star alignment were all marked with monitoring brands. But, most importantly, this order was requested by young Miss Era herself. As for what this means in totality, I'm not sure. But, it for certain means that this young lady has the influence or, at the very least, the net worth necessary to accomplish such a thing. Het Solar's brows furrowed. What are you trying to get at? I feel you mean something more by telling us how potentially powerful she is, correct? Yes. Don't you think it's odd that, not to mention the fact the two haven't gotten married, but they haven't even set a date for their wedding yet? Almost like the Kiefer family heir still hasn't proved himself yet. So, what kind of status would he gain once he did gain such acknowledgement? What if this acknowledgement is more important than any backing Valiant Heart Mountain could ever provide? The two heads sucked in a cold breath before a deathly silence fell over the room. Then, what should we do? Het Mirage was the one to finally break the silence. Het Falls didn't answer for a long while. For a moment, the two thought that he might never respond at all. But, when he finally did speak, they felt a swirl of complex emotions were surging within them. As things stand now, Earth still has a chance to defend itself. Though they're feeling the pressure, it isn't to the point their loss is guaranteed. As the saying goes, delivering coal in the winter is better than delivering water to an already smothered flame. What chance would Earth stand if instead of half our world's strength, it faced the entire brunt? Het Falls left the meeting of powers with a smirk on his face, a sharp glint lighting his eye. Chapter 464, Royal Blue Fort. The atmosphere was heated. The amount of pressure placed on the fort itself wasn't as great as one would have expected. At the very least, the colonists of Earth's two moons and the citizens of the capital were under far greater stress. The reason for this was obvious, but also placed the members of the fort in a terrible situation all the same. Unlike the capital, which had been revitalized and truly looked like a province once again, Royal Blue Province was still mostly in shambles. The only location of proper society was the fort. So why would the people of Terrain bother to attack right away? For different situations, different tactics were required. Camelot was a small terrain and mostly inhabited. As such, White City launched a full assault from the very beginning. Author's note: from now on, whenever Camelot is mentioned, assume it's in reference to Earth's second moon unless the context says otherwise. However, Royal Blue Province was now mostly untouched territory. Other than the fort itself, the rest was just collapsed buildings, invalids, beasts, and the occasional outcast gang that overestimated themselves. Lionel had met such an outcast gang in the moments before he entered the Joan Zone. But he had dealt with them quite easily in his rage due to their grotesque remarks about Aina. These outcasts were fools who thought they would be able to avoid the hand of the Empire when things finally settled down, when in reality they would likely be among the first killed when things truly reached that point. But now, to the people of Terrain, these outcasts had become a hot commodity. Since Earth was such a new world, most of its original citizens, by default, were within the 5th generation and beyond. This made every Earthener the people of Terrain ran across a hotly contested item. Yes, item. Not person. This situation left the people of Earth in an odd limbo. The capital was under a full-blown assault and unable to lend out help, while the rest of Earth's land was being rapidly colonized. The only way to stop this would be to send out armies from the forts to slow them down. But how could these nobles that had just turtled themselves up dare to make a move so easily? They continued to cower within their walls, waiting for someone else to take action. After all, with the death of Miles, they could just pretend that they didn't have proper direction. Then, everything would fall on the shoulders of the Governor Duke or the Secretary Marquisette. They wouldn't have to take any responsibility whatsoever. This was the harsh reality that peace could bring about. The sharpness the empire that once swept through Earth had dulled considerably. While there were no pushovers amongst nobles, it was also because of this that none of them wanted to rashly make a move. What if their sacrifice benefited another? How could they guarantee that their credit would be their own and not that of someone else's? This situation led to the fort closing its dome once again. As for the commoners on the outside, did they need to care for them? But it was in exactly this situation that the large oak doors to the gathering of nobles opened. A deathly silence fell. The number of people who dared to do such a thing were simply too few. And, since it was unlikely to be a person of the capital, it was pretty clear to them all who this person was. As expected, the clicking of heels reverberated through the quiet congressional hall. A beauty strolled in, her hips swinging like a hypnotic pendulum. It didn't seem like she had done it on purpose, but rather that innate charm exuded from her very pores. Despite the fact they all knew she had been an old hag just a year prior, the men within the room couldn't help but feel their loins light on fire. Who else could this person be if not Secretary Marquisette Maya? After another long disappearance, she had finally come back once again. As though nothing had changed, she easily sat at the helm of the hall, not feeling as though there was anything wrong in the slightest. One of the nobles frowned. Secretary Marquisette, this isn't appropriate. As a chief earl, the chief law officer of Royal Blue Province, there were few who knew the law better than Chief Earl Fiel. The position of one's seating was highly important to setting precedential hierarchy. But Maya now sat in a position reserved for the Governor Duke. Even Miles hadn't been allowed to do this. In fact, Miles couldn't sit at any one of the leadership positions. Maya didn't respond directly. She only dug into her bosom and pulled out a noble crest. With a single look, any one of them could recognize it. Those rushing waters, the strong shield that blocked them from the lush grounds to its back. There was no doubt this was the Luem family's crest. Chief Earl Fiel sat back down silently. There was already nothing more to say. In my absence, it seems that you all have had quite a bit of fun to yourselves, HM? Maya said lightly. The nobles remained silent. They couldn't understand how this woman who so rarely appeared still wielded so much power. Just how did she do it? It seems that you all have forgotten what it means to be the nobles of the Ascension Empire. You all have felt too comfortable for too long. His Majesty Emperor Fox has ordered a code black martial law state, effective immediately. At that moment, the nobles who had managed to maintain their cool shot out from their seats, shock coloring their features. A code black state? Wasn't that too rash? Such a state could only be called upon when the Empire was in danger of falling, but they were still very far from this future. What the hell was going on? Of course, this was only a very small part of why they were all so shocked. Code Black martial law had the fewest laws and restrictions of any state. But it had one very important clause that shook the nobles to their core. In such a state, everything was earned by merits. When it concluded and everything returned to normal, even their very own noble positions would be up for grabs and exchangeable for merits. Even the title of Grand Prime Minister or even Prince could be exchanged for. As for those who didn't have enough merits, they would lose the noble seats they spent so much of their time protecting. Chapter 465. From now on I will be in charge. Secretary Marquisette Maya's demeanor completely shifted. From a coquettish, seductive air, the atmosphere around her became oppressive and heavy. It felt as though she had become a completely different person. No, it was like she had gone back to being that old hag of over a year ago. First, the scouting missions will be ramping up. I want anyone with speed, concealment and sensory abilities to be inserted in a reconnaissance unit effective immediately. The only exceptions I will allow are those in commanding roles. All Tier 5 admirals will be responsible for securing a 10-kilometer coastal buffer. The ocean has been ruled by beasts for too long. How useless are you all for allowing this to continue? All Tier 5 generals will be in rotating vanguard positions. I don't want there to be a single moment in any single day where there is not any pressure being applied on these jumping monkeys of terrain. How long do you intend to allow them to gallivant on our turf? Is this what being a noble means to you? General Umbred, General Sater, General Tudo. Consider yourselves demoted. Your replacements will be the new General Milan, General Raj and General Joel. What? General Umbred stood in a rage, his mustache furiously blowing in all his anger. Sit down. Umbred felt a cold shiver course through his veins. He met Maya's cold gaze, completely unable to stop his body from trembling. While you were holding yourself up in the safety of this dome, those three led a vanguard against the invalid tide. Yet, you still dare to call yourself a general and even raise your voice toward me? Who do you think you are? I sentence you to 3 years in Dark Cloud Prison. Take him away. Umbred froze in shock. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Dark Cloud Prison wasn't a death sentence for himself, but it was most definitely one for his career. He couldn't believe what was happening. He didn't even know who this Milan person replacing him was, nor did he know a Joel or Raj. All he knew was they had to be commoners because the only ones who would have led a vanguard against that invalid tide were those with no standing. All he had done was follow the lead of everyone else, yet he was suffering the most. Even worse, because he couldn't control his temper, he ended up in an even worse position than the other two. Seeing such a scene, former General Sater and Tudo didn't even dare to breathe too heavily. They could only watch with sunken expressions as Umbred was escorted out of the hall, his expression dark as could be. No one who had a criminal record was allowed to hold a government position above Tier 3. Umbred was finished and the legacy his family had built to now had all come crumbling down just with a few words. Do you all really think I don't know what's been happening in my absence? This sort of dereliction of duty will not be tolerated. Every offender will receive a more damning sentence than the last. The next person to step out of line will receive 5 years, the next 10. Don't try my patience. Maya continued as though nothing had happened, listing off her commands. The more the nobles listened, the more they realized that Maya had ears everywhere. Every one of her new laws of order was pointed at a very particular problem that was almost impossible to notice on a whim. The more she spoke, the more the nobles felt their hearts tighten. They sat up straighter, their demeanor becoming several levels more respectful. At the same time, they began to look toward one another with wary gazes. The only way Maya could have managed this was if she had informants. But it was impossible to tell who they were. It left them all on the edge of their seats. They had no idea who had been secretly observing them all. As clever men and women used to the world of politics, they tried to pay attention to who Maya put in positions of power, trying to see if they could deduce who to be wary of in the future. But the more they tried to deduce, the more frustrated they became. The only obvious promotion Maya handed out was to those 3 commoners. The rest were either inconsequential or didn't change much at all. It left them all in a state of limbo, as though they were suspended above an abyss they could fall to the bottom of at any time. If they didn't know Maya was doing this on purpose by now, they wouldn't be worth the noble titles they had. With this kind of perpetual pressure, which of them would dare to step out of line? Finally, reorganize the inner city and make room for the commoners to enter. Level the outer city and repurpose the steel walls for some more practical defenses. The nobles felt like cleaning out their ears. What did Maya say just now? Allow the commoners in? Maya's words were final. She didn't even bother to explain herself from start to finish. She never gave a reason for anything, but deep inside, the nobles knew exactly why she made every decision. This was the only one they couldn't quite wrap their minds around. But Maya didn't give some heartfelt speech about the importance of the people to convince them. She simply left her words behind and swayed her hips to leave. Internally, Maya giggled. Consider this a repayment of your favor, Lionel. You helped me gain the foothold I wanted in the Slayer Legion, and now I've reformed Royal Blue Fort to your ideals. Be sure to put in a good word for me to your Gramps. Maya smiled lightly, her mind spinning at speeds that could rival even Lionel's. As for what her plans and goals were, maybe only Maya herself knew this. Maya suddenly sped up her steps. Don't worry, Mommy's coming. Maya happily sashayed away. She really didn't like being away from her child. Even though the doctors swore the incubator was top of the line, she still preferred to oversee it all personally. On Camelot. Khalid is dead. Author's note below: December 17, 21. Chapter 466. One would think that such a report would have landed on City Lord White's desk a long time ago. However, the City Lord wasn't the type of woman who enjoyed listening to reports on what she deemed as useless points. All she cared about was the result. Not only had the Lin barony fallen, but it had fallen within the time frame she had set. The number of soldiers she had lost were less important to her than the tasks they managed to complete. This might sound like a maddening philosophy to have, even to the point where it dehumanized one's own subordinates, and even worse, could be seen as foolish, but it was clear that City Lord White didn't care about the optics of such things. In the end, the result was an odd situation where City Lord White only learned about the passing of one of her White Knights over a week later. Naya nodded. Yes, City Lord. He died along with 511 Predator Ravens. During the siege of the Lin and Pervaux baronies, we lost 37 of our 1022 men before managing to claim their territory. Soldier Cop took over White Knight Dior's position and has been taking control of the law and order of the troops. City Lord White waved a hand. Why are you telling me all of this? Naya didn't seem surprised the City Lord White didn't care about all these details. In truth, she wanted to be out on the battlefield herself, but this was a war where White City was just a single gear in a working system. She couldn't do as she pleased. She had to follow the plans laid out by the Kiafur family. This left her feeling quite antsy and irritable. She only managed to keep things together since it was Naya who was speaking. If it was anyone else, they likely would have tasted Clara by now. And the only reason Naya had such a pass wasn't because City Lord White allowed nonsense from her. Rather, it was because the City Lord was aware that Naya knew better than to waste her time. So, if Naya was bringing this up, it meant she had a very good reason to do so. There was a reason Naya was the only one allowed to be so near the City Lord so consistently. According to a report sent by Acting Commander Kopp, White Knight Dior lost in single combat at the hands of a child by the name of Lionel Morales. City Lord White's annoyed expression faded and she looked up at Naya. Naya nodded once again despite the fact City Lord White hadn't actually spoken any words. There are 3 things that we have to pay great attention to during this war. The first is the interference of the hidden families. The second is the interference of higher dimensional worlds. And lastly, we have to pay particular attention to the wielders of the world spirit. According to what is known, the second, third and fourth completers have well-known identities. However, the first completer has yet to be found. According to our intelligence and deductions, there are 3 individuals who have the potential to be the first completer. One of these individuals is expressly this Lionel Morales. City Lord White slowly stood. The world spirit, even in comparison to the interference of higher dimensional worlds, was the greatest potential variable of this world. The good news was that the world spirit should have been split into 4 parts. When in such a sparse situation, the abilities of the world spirit were significantly nerfed to the point of practically having no use. This in addition to the fact the abilities of world spirits were quite infantile at the early stages of such a world, and it wouldn't be a large problem even if it was whole. However, the world spirit is what truly decided sovereignty over a world. Terrain had to ensure to grasp at least one of these 4 portions. Only by doing so would they be able to truly lay claim to this world. Also, though she is not among the most likely 3 I just mentioned, there is intelligence that Aina Brazinger is currently present on the battlefields. From our intelligence, she has a very close relationship with Lionel Morales. So, although she's unlikely to have been the first completer, getting to her would be valuable regardless. Why do you wait so long to bring such information to me? I finally get to set out. City Lord wait. Naya raised her voice slightly so that City Lord White didn't just storm off. If this short-haired woman caught a head of steam, it would be almost impossible to stop her. What is it? It isn't appropriate to make a move just yet. Our original plan didn't account for the Empire already having a presence on this moon already. But it seems that before we appeared, the Empire had already sent Prince Noah Fox here to lead an army to assimilate Camelot and the Demon Empire. Noah Fox, isn't that? Yes, the third completer, Prince Noah Fox. Isn't that even better? That means there are 2 potential world spirit pieces here. While this is true, it also means that we have to be careful. Prince Fox has already begun to lead a counterattack and we've already lost half of the territory we initially snatched due to poor foundations. Isn't that just more reason for me to go? Why are you wasting my time? City Lord White's expression darkened. Yes, it is important that you go, but not so that you can target Lionel Morales. We need to prepare a proper counterattack and sweep through Camelot in a single sweep. I suggest that you wait for us to turn Lynn and Provaux baronies into proper launch points. Both are important resources. Lynn barony is a choke point that separates the kingdom from the wilderness. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's perfect for starving them of natural resources, whether that be wood or fresh water. Provaux barony forms the final point of a triangle between Lynn barony and Camelot and is a final barrier to the no man's land that separates Camelot and the Demon Empire. It's a perfect launch point to attack both the Demon Empire and the kingdom. We will secure the supply lines, cut off Camelot's resources, and create a perfect foundation for attack. Then you can move out, City Lord. City Lord White stared at Naya deeply for a moment before sitting back down. How much time? 2 months at the fastest, 3 at the latest. Fine. They'll let them live for a little longer then. Chapter 467. The people of Terrain had no idea that the world spirit hadn't been separated into 4 like it would on other worlds. In Earth's case, a rare instance to be sure, the world spirit chose its host before the metamorphosis began. But somehow this news was kept as a complete secret. Even after years of preparation, Terrain was completely unaware. That said, could they be blamed? A 4th-dimensional world with limited talent and scope like Terrain wasn't even aware that a world spirit could make such autonomous decisions at such an early stage. Due to the fact they weren't aware, they weren't even looking for it before Earth's metamorphosis began. As the saying went, you didn't know what you didn't know. How could Terrain be aware of something they weren't even aware they should be aware about in the first place? After the metamorphosis began, Terrain used special channels to learn about who the 4 completers were. Through their investigations, they managed to learn about 3 of them, the 3rd completer of which was Prince Noah Fox. Of course, no one was aware of the fact that due to him waking up so much earlier than everyone else, Lionel was by far the first to complete his own. In fact, the time difference was a staggering several-month gap. If it wasn't for the fact Lionel was injured to the point of falling into a coma and having to be nursed back to health by Uncle Montes, he would have exited long before anyone else, and his status as the first completer would have been more obvious to all. But for now, others could only speculate about his identity. Still, even then, Lionel's performance was so dazzling that he had become a prime suspect regardless. Prince Noah Fox stood tall on a battlefield, his breathing almost too even. It was difficult to tell that he had just been in a battle to begin with. Despite the fact the corpses of his enemies laid before him, their blood dripping from the blade of his saber, he didn't seem happy in the slightest. They're stalling. Noah spoke to no one in particular. This white city was exceptionally cruel. Without thought for casualties, they threw army after army of troops at them. It was as though they wanted them to waste time cutting them all down like they were weeds to be disgusted by rather than people. In truth, Noah was indifferent to it all. He just didn't like what it could possibly mean. Since they were stalling, there had to be a purpose for it. So what was that purpose exactly? At that moment, an agile black wolf of over 3 meters tall shot to Noah's side. In one instant, it was as swift as the wind, and in the next it came to a grinding halt without warning. It was as though it had never been running to begin with. A petite young woman with short hair swooped down from the top of the wolf. Your Highness, it may be time to begin to coordinate with Camelot and the Demon Empire. It's clear that they've prepared for a long time and know more about us than we do them. Though we've won all of our battles, they're hollow victories. Jessica spoke as plainly as she always did. It had already been a month since Noah had a conversation with his grandfather. In that time he had managed to reclaim over half the territory White City had taken from Camelot, but there were a few problems with this. For one, technology wasn't functioning as it once had. Without it, it wasn't possible to erect forts like they had on Earth with any sort of speed. So, though they had reclaimed the land, it was more like they had pushed out White City's presence. Secondly, White City had managed to keep a strict hold of two strategic points even to now. Though they lost battles without a care, they always managed to keep control over what was truly important. Thirdly, they hadn't originally come here for such a long drawn-out war. Thanks to their skills, food and water wasn't a problem, but there was more than this one needed for war. They needed a steady supply of weapons and weapon maintenance options, which they didn't have. They needed healers and doctors, but they were in short supply of them. And they needed numbers in order to keep control and scout out the areas they had taken hold of. But they had none of these things. Due to this, Noah had hoped to make a strong push and place White City on its back foot as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, though he succeeded, the issue was that their success wasn't great enough to warrant any sort of happiness. It was essentially hollow. Noah nodded. I agree. I believe we've displayed enough of our strength. With a shake of his wrist, a strong vibration shot through Noah's blue-bladed saber. His strength caused the metal to bend and groan, whipping the blood on its way. In an instant, the blade was once again spotless. Should we arrange a meeting? No. We will meet on the battlefield. Noah said plainly. Understood. While Noah was leading attacks toward Pervot Barony, heading a charge from the direction of No Man's Land, Camelot and the Demon Empire was heading a charge toward Lynn Barony. Yet, despite this pincer attack from both sides, White City continued to fend off their attempts. The dauntless approach of the soldiers of White City shook the knights and mages of Camelot to the core. To be so fearless in death, even after so many battles, wore on the souls of their enemies, making them feel as though this was a battle they would never win. As a result, despite the fact King Arthur had been experiencing maybe the most peaceful time of his life, it was overshadowed by a perpetual fog that hung over Camelot. What didn't help was the fact Camelot lacked the same level of organization White City's armies did. And as their knights and mages awakened to their new abilities, it made the battlefield even more chaotic than they should have been. Without proper guidance on how to use these suddenly newfound powers, Camelot's victories were even more Pyrrhic than Noah's had been. It was on this day, on yet another battlefield, that Aina could be found, her lips tightly sealed as she swung her great sword toward another enemy. Chapter 468. Aina felt her arms trembling on impact. She could see the indifferent eyes of the White City soldier through their crossed blades. However, despite the dull pain in her arms and the trembling of her knees, her gaze too remained unmoved. Somewhere deep inside she quite appreciated these soldiers of White City. Their emotionless, unquestionable resolve toward battle, as though they could forget about everything else other than the opponents before them. She too could resonate with this feeling. While Lionel felt an excitement when he laid eyes on a battlefield, Aina felt a soothing calm. However, the raging blood in her veins told a completely different story. Unfortunately, this battlefield was completely unlike the battles Aina had experienced in the Joan Zone or even against the Invalids and Braziner family members she faced alongside Lionel. Whereas in those battles she reaped lives as though they were weeds, on this battlefield she felt as though it was her own life that was constantly in danger. Even finding an opponent like this whom she was evenly matched with was a problem. This wasn't because Aina was too weak, but rather because the soldiers of White City were simply too strong. Aina needed to exchange several moves to take down just a single one. And, since this was a battlefield and not a sanctioned duel, how could it possibly be that she would always be allowed a one-on-one battle? Aina dug deep, a light shout parting her lips as she pressed her great sword forward. An audible snap rang out. But, on such a large battlefield, the only two who likely heard it were Aina and the soldier before her. Other than a light flash in his gaze, the soldier didn't show any other reaction to Aina's blade piercing through his shoulder and cutting down through his hip. Aina took deep breath, her amber eyes shooting forward as though already looking for a new opponent. But she quickly found that there were already none left. At that moment, an irrational rage welled up in her heart as she pulled her sword out from the corpse before her. Unfortunately, this small action caused her legs to tremble beneath the weight she carried. Aina stabbed her sword into the ground, her body almost unable to continue standing. Heal, Aina urged through her own thoughts, forcing her body to rapidly repair itself. The strain caused her scars to become even more inflamed. If others were paying attention, it would become very obvious that the restrictions Aina was under didn't leave even her ability be. Just as Aina's vision was swimming, she suddenly felt an arm wrap around her shoulders. She looked up to find Mordred looking toward her with a worried expression. Mordred was quite tall for a woman, almost a head taller than Aina. Even so, her visage was quite clear. Are you all right? Aina nodded faintly. Mordred wanted to say more, but her expression suddenly changed. It can't be another one? Mordred's brow furrowed. Is there a problem? Aina looked around the battlefield, but from what she could see, it was another victory. Though they had lost quite a number of knights and mages, it was still a victory nonetheless. Those that hadn't died had already long since retreated, so it was hard to tell what reason there could possibly be to have such a reaction. That said, Aina was also very much aware that her sensory abilities weren't very good. So, she deferred to the most talented mage of Camelot. Aside from maybe Lionel, it was doubtful that there was anyone else on this moon with stronger internal sight in comparison to the Demon Empress. Mordred's brows furrowed tighter. It's another army. I thought it was more men from White City, but it seems like this isn't the case. If it's not them, then it's more likely that it's the Empire? According to what Mordred knew, the Empire had been attacking from the direction of Provost's barony. Though it hadn't been expressly stated, their actions most definitely took a lot of pressure off of Camelot and allowed the Demon Empire to focus all their thoughts on support. What Mordred expected the least, though, was that they'd leave their pincer position and come here. What purpose did they have for doing this? It can't be that they wanted to attack Camelot now, right? At the moment, this battlefield was under Mordred's command and the large majority of the troops were demons. As for King Arthur's armies, they were on the more northern wing of the battlefield. This was for the best. Though they now had an alliance, one couldn't just magically forget the past enmities between humans and demons. So, trying to fuse them into one fighting force would be like asking for problems to break out. This was all to say that in order for the Empire to make it to them, they would most definitely have to go through Mordred and her men first. It doesn't look like they came to battle, but it doesn't look like they came on friendly terms either. After a while passed, the Empire's armies finally entered Aina's sensory ranges. She was exceptionally sensitive to matters related to battle and could read the air quite well. The Empire definitely wasn't here for peace, but they didn't seem to be here to battle either. One might want to say that they came here as a neutral party, but it wasn't quite that either. At the helm of the army, Prince Noah Fox stood on the back of a black wolf. Despite its swaying body, he didn't seem to be impacted in the slightest. To his back, a group of nearly 1,000 followed along. Many were also riding such wolves, but others rode various other beasts. Though the army wasn't completely uniform due to this, they still carried an oddly structured and strict air to them. Even their mismatching beasts couldn't detract from this. It didn't take Mordred much to realize that these beasts were actually the demonic beasts of No Man's Land. Somehow, the Empire had subjugated and domesticated these wild beasts even to the point of taking them to war. Noah had no idea that this action alone left Mordred in more awe than any of their other combined other actions had. Only she, who had been trying to reel in and reign over these beasts for decades, knew exactly how difficult it was. What was their goal here exactly? Chapter 469. The slow approach of the Empire's warriors eventually put Mordred at ease. It seemed that Aina's words had been correct. If their goal was to attack, they would have long since broken out into a charge. But their current pace was almost like a leisurely stroll. In fact, they even allowed Mordred enough time to reorganize her army and face their entourage head-on. By now, Arthur's warriors had also noticed the oddity. "Your Majesty, should we send someone?" Arthur shook his head. "We'll go personally. Allow the men some rest and treat the injured. There's no telling when they will choose to attack again." Noah's troops came to a halt about 100 meters from Mordred's front line. Without a word, a small squad of 5 broke off, riding their black wolves forward swiftly. Though their pace was still a bit faster than the army had been, it still didn't seem like their goal was to attack. The group of 5 was led by a young man. The expression on his face was indifferent and lofty. He carried the air of arrogance nobility should have, but without allowing it to grow overblown. It was just enough to put many in a state of awe without allowing them to feel any sort of disgust. It was clear that this young man's air of superiority was ingrained down to his very bones. When the small squad made it to within 5 meters of Mordred, they came to a stop, maintaining a healthy distance. "I am the representative of His Highness, Prince Noah Fox, Junior Governor Duke Niall Briarmouth. Who is your leader?" Niall's voice boomed over the battlefield. He didn't seem to realize that Mordred was right before him. Whether he did it on purpose or not, it was hard to tell. However, regardless, Mordred maintained her composure. She had been through much more in her life. If there was one thing she was excellent at, it was maintaining her calm. "I am the leader of the Demon Empire," she said unhurriedly. "I am the leader of Camelot. At that moment, Arthur had made his way to Mordred's side. His expression wasn't as calm as his daughter's. Rather, it still held a lofty air. Niall looked down from his position atop his wolf, sweeping a glance over the two of them. His gaze happened to catch upon Aina, her appearance causing him to frown. Her face made him inwardly uncomfortable, but he hid it well. There was no need to linger on such things. Though he could be wild at other times, it was unnecessary at this moment. But just when he planned to focus on Arthur and Mordred once again, his lips even opening to speak, his gaze sharpened. He looked back toward Aina. His eyes landed on the hand she used to lean against her great sword with. No, it was more accurate to say that his gaze landed on the wrist of the hand she was using. Even at this moment, Aina's breathing was still a bit haggard. The only reason she was still at the front of the army was because Mordred had insisted on keeping her by her side because she was worried about Aina's current state. For the past month and a half or so, Aina had done nothing but battle. It was hard to allow such a petite young girl to bear such a burden on her shoulders constantly, but Aina insisted to the point Mordred couldn't reject. You. Aina didn't think anyone would be talking to her at this moment, so she was entirely focused on her recovery. She was trying to force her ability to activate again, but it had slowed down considerably. Her reaction, though, caused Niall's frown to deepen. As though finally sensing that the atmosphere was oddly silent, Aina looked up, only to find that Niall's gaze was locked onto her. Of course, Aina was confused by this. She wasn't well known among the nobles. And even if she was, this definitely wouldn't be the face they recognize. Beyond that, she didn't share the red hair and eyes of the Brazinger family. Even one of her own family members only managed to recall her due to his perfect recall ability, and he had long since been buried beneath dozens of meters of earth. So, it was even less likely that she'd be remembered for this. State your name and which province you come from. Are you planning on defecting from the Empire? Niall's gaze sharpened, boring into Aina as though trying to force her into a confession. Yet, despite looking up toward Niall with tired eyes, Aina didn't seem intimidated in the slightest. What a joke! If Aina could remain calm and unperturbed beneath Lionel's aura, what was a mere junior Governor Duke worth? Of course, at this moment, Aina wasn't necessarily thinking of things in such simple terms. She only knew that she was unmoved by it all. In fact, she was even slightly annoyed. Compared to others, Aina was actually quite thankful for the Empire. If not for it, she would have likely suffered even more hardship as a child. But Aina's main priority was still revenge. What the Empire cared about her actions toward reaching this goal meant little to nothing to her. My name is Aina Brazinger, I come from Royal Blue Province. No, I have no intention of defecting from the Empire. Aina replied somewhat wearily. Then how is it that you are here and not protecting Royal Blue Fort? Niall's words froze. Did you just say Aina Brazinger? Niall suddenly remembered that almost a year ago now, they received a report that they would be gaining 2 more variants from Royal Blue Fort. One was a certain Lionel Morales and the second was Aina Brazinger. But, for whatever reason, those 2 never appeared. Due to Earth's talents, after over a year of development, the rarity of variants had plummeted as well. From just a handful it had blossomed to several thousand. In fact, in their current army, not a single one wasn't a variant. Of course, those who were variants from the very beginning were far more valuable. And Lionel and Aina were among this very rare few. In fact, considering where they started, they should be among the few who already had abilities within the 5th dimension. However, with this didn't come leniency. Rather, it made Aina's wrongdoing several times more severe. The action of not properly reporting to the capital could be considered a direct defiance of the Emperor's will. After reaching this point in his thoughts, Niall's aura became baleful. Chapter 470. Seeing that the situation was taking a turn for the worse, Mordred took a step forward and blocked Aina to her back, feeling slightly protective of this young girl. Aina is not tied with us, she is only here as a helper. Mordred tried to explain. Niall's gaze remained locked onto Aina. Aina felt her vision swimming, her feet feeling somewhat unsteady. From an outsider's perspective, it seemed as though she was feeling pressured by Niall's gaze. But the reality was that her body seemed to want to shut down at this moment. After several minutes of trying to force her ability to activate, her situation only got worse. In fact, it seemed as though the repressive effects of her scars was getting fiercer. Without the energy she needed to fight back against it, the situation she was facing only grew worse. The reason she is here is irrelevant. The fact that she is here at all is already a challenge to His Majesty's sovereignty. The momentum of Nile and the 4 wolf riders to his back grew. In the Ascension Empire, there were only a handful of titles without a democratic prefix attached to it. The reason behind this was clear: other than the royal family, others had to constantly scratch and claw for their positions. Any failure to do so would result in the destruction of countless generations of effort. Due to this structure, the empire had fostered a sense of complete and unquestionable loyalty. Those who failed to meet such standards could just as easily be ostracized during the next cycle of elections. It was also exactly because of this reason that there were no noble families with useless heirs, as useless heirs would only drive the effort of the family into the ground. If Nile was found to have been aware of a traitor to the empire yet hadn't taken action, the consequences would be unimaginable. To begin with, the Briarmouth family didn't hold control over a powerful province. In fact, his Evergreen province was located in harsh wintry climates year-round, resulting in an economy that was somewhat crippled. They lacked resources or tourist-worthy locations. To compensate for this, the Evergreen province was, ironically, a province filled with factories and was as such ranked 8th amongst the provinces. And, unfortunately, the only reason they were not ranked 9th was because Dark Cloud Province, the location of Dark Cloud Prison, was considered unranked. It could be considered a blessing to the family that Nile had awakened as a variant and had had the opportunity to stay by the prince's side for the past year. But he was also aware that his standing, even compared to some Secretary Marquisate families, was lacking. As such, he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He had to uphold the justice of the empire properly. By this point, though, Aina's mind was far too foggy to consider her surroundings. She stumbled and fell backward, only to be caught by Mordred, who realized that something had gone wrong. But Nile had yet to finish speaking. "And I also hope that as a power soon to be under the jurisdiction of the empire, that you wouldn't be harboring a criminal, correct?" Nile's gaze landed on Mordred and Arthur once again, his words far more forceful. In the distance, Noah remained unmoved by it all. The distance was only 100 meters, so with his newfound strength, he could easily hear the words Nile was speaking. Since he didn't find anything wrong with Nile's approach, he didn't make any moves. "Aina Brazinger, is it?" Noah's jaw steeled. He recognized this name. Could she be from that family? But she didn't have the signature hair and eye color. Though Earth couldn't be considered as large as the universe, obviously, there were still many instances of unrelated people having the same last names. Knowing this, it was no wonder even those who were aware of the Morales name didn't automatically assume Lionel's origins. But, in a world as small as Earth, especially after the eradication of over 99% of their population, such instances should be much rarer. Was there really such a coincidence? It was no surprise that Noah was sensitive to the names of these hidden families. His grandfather had said that there were many enemies eyeing their Earth, and these hidden families were no exception. Noah wasn't quite sure of the origin of these families. But, there were 2 running theories he had come up with under his own research and a bit of Jessica's help. The first possibility was that these hidden families were existences that once vied for supremacy over Earth like their Fox family had. Though it was easy to ignore it, but didn't their Fox family also all have the same white gold hair and emerald green eyes? When Noah realized this on a certain day not that many years ago, he felt as though his whole world had been flipped upside down. Could it really be that their Fox family was just another hidden family that happened to claim victory? It was possible. But there was also a second possibility as well. This possibility was far more sinister. And if this was true, Noah would stop at nothing to eradicate these hidden families. With so many higher dimensional worlds eyeing them, could it really be possible that none of them took any measures to claim a piece of Earth for themselves? What if the hidden families were actually branch members of higher dimensional worlds that sent their people here in order to reach the 5th generation as quickly as possible? If that was the case, wouldn't that mean that those higher dimensional worlds weren't as far away as they all thought? As for which of these 2 theories was correct, Noah had no idea. But, what he did know was that he couldn't allow someone with the Brazinger family name to run around freely. And even if Aina's last name wasn't Brazinger, her crimes alone would have definitely warranted detainment. "Seize her," Nile said coldly. "Well, take her back to the capital for trial after all of this is over." Author's note below, December 20th, 21. Chapter 471. Mordred felt slightly panicked. Obviously, this wasn't because she feared Nile's strength. Whether it be by her own opinion or by the fact of reality, the truth was that there were very few on the current Earth that could match Mordred in power. The issue was that this wasn't a situation she could brute force her way out of. Even if she easily deflected the advancement of these wolf riders, what would she do about the 1,000-strong army to their back? And even if they somehow managed to repel them, what would happen to the situation with White City if they suddenly began to infight? Even though the Empire seemed to be helping now, Mordred and Arthur alike were very much aware that Camelot wasn't their home ground. The Empire could easily choose to retreat and focus on Earth and come back. But could they do the same? They could technically find a place on Earth, but what could their millions of citizens do? Where would they place them? Unlike on Earth, where many if not most had some level of combat prowess by now and had tempered themselves over a year of hardship, the people of Camelot were still lagging behind in this aspect. Even as they awakened to their abilities, they were completely unused to using them and would be even more useless on a battlefield. To make matters worse, Camelot didn't have a monitoring system like Earth did, so rounding everyone up would likely take months. By then, how many more would they lose? Boy, I think that's enough. At that moment, King Arthur took a step forward. The sight of his valiant heir and white lion engraved armor was something to behold indeed. Despite having chosen to yield to the Empire, that kingly air of his hadn't diminished in the slightest. He only stood there before his daughter and Aina, yet it felt as though the beasts engraved onto his white armor had come to life, causing the black wolves Nile and the other road to tremble slightly. They might have been demon beasts, but just how many of these beasts had Arthur killed in his life? He had long since lost count. Nile frowned. Are you sure that you're aware of what you're doing? I'm well aware of what I'm doing. I have no idea what laws of your land this child has broken, but what I do know is that she's been fighting for our and your sake all this time. Is this what your empire does to those that fight for them? Nile's expression grew cold. Are you questioning the empire? I have yet to become one of your people. Arthur replied just as coldly, taking a step forward that forced the shivering black wolves into an even sorrier position. In fact, I believe that in your minds I am still nothing but a fairy tale, is that correct? Arthur scanned the five before him and even sent a glance toward Noah in the distance. Despite meeting Arthur's gaze, Noah remained unmoved. A clash of royal air shot through the battlefield, making the atmosphere several times heavier. I may be just an inconsequential fictional character in your minds, but you shouldn't forget that you're currently standing on my fictional lands, breathing my fictional air, and are in my fictional presence. Until the day Camelot cedes to the Empire, this will still be the case. If you want to take people under my protection beneath my nose, you'll have to taste my blade first. The black wolves reeled and whined, kicking up to their hind legs. If it wasn't for the strength of their riders, Nile and the others would have definitely been kicked off. Nile didn't seem to notice the poor performance of his black wolf. His eyes remained locked onto Arthur as though he was prepared to attack at any given moment. Nile, return. Noah's cold voice rang through the battlefield. His words alone seemed to dispel Arthur's aura, calming the black wolves down in an instant. The contrast was so drastic that even Arthur himself narrowed his eyes. Nile didn't hesitate to follow Noah's orders, clicking his heels against the coat of his wolf and dashing back to the Empire's troops. Mordred looked toward her father's back with a complicated glance. On one hand, Mordred knew that this had always been her father's character. He wasn't a man who took kindly to others looking down on him. But, by the same token, over the years, he had begun to somewhat allow others to trample over him. It seemed as though Arthur was overly prideful, but hadn't he allowed the church and the thoughts of the nobles to dictate his own thoughts for a long time? There was no doubt that he had been hypocritical in this aspect in the past, but now he managed to hold his head high even after choosing to submit to the Empire. This was in stark contrast to the him of the past. It even brought a smile to Mordred's face before she could even reel it back in. It was at that very moment that Aina suddenly collapsed completely. Aina. Mordred was shocked. She had been propping Aina up from the very beginning, so she immediately realized the change in the weight she had to uphold. When Aina could no longer support her own self, Mordred was at a loss because even she herself almost collapsed. What the hell is this weight? This girl. Mordred sent a glance toward Aina's great sword and the massive curved box on her back. This was a level of weight that even a 3-star Grand Knight wouldn't be able to carry around, let alone do battle with. What the hell was this little girl thinking? Mordred took action immediately, doing her best to pry the sword out of her hands and the package off her back. But Aina's grip was so steely that Mordred found she couldn't budge it in the slightest. Aina's face flushed red before draining into a sickly pale color. Her breathing became short and somewhat hurried, her lips slightly parted. Mordred's eyes widened. Faye? Mordred hesitated. But luckily, Arthur turned back in time to see his daughter's pleading gaze. Please heal her. Arthur's gaze became serious as he nodded. But just when he was about to take action, the Empire's troops moved. "I'm greatly disappointed by your choice, Arthur." Noah's black wolf stalked forward, the army to his back moving as one. "He'll give you another chance." An oppressive aura surged out from Noah, a blue-bladed saber appearing in his hand. The moment it did, the black wolf beneath his feet collapsed, its spine snapping in half beneath the weight. Yet, Noah's steps didn't falter in the slightest, his aura only growing with an added bloodthirsty air. Arthur's gaze became serious as he turned back. But no one expected for the situation at that moment to change once again. Hi. Beating war drums and blaring horns sounded from the distance. A woman with short hair, dressed in black robes accented by white flexible armor and wielding a massive two-headed hammer, stood at the helm of an army, her battle aura towering. Chapter 472. The battlefield was suddenly thrust into an unseemly situation. Camelot and the Demon Empire faced off against the Empire, but now there was White City who had suddenly inserted themselves into the mix. Arthur, Mordred and Noah could immediately tell with absolute certainty that this army of White Cities was much different than it had been in the past. Its aura was more oppressive, its momentum much more frightening, and the commander at its helm was on a completely different level. Noah's sharp gaze swept toward City Lord White's direction. They were still over a kilometer away, but by the time they broke out into a charge, it wouldn't even take a few minutes for them to cross over the final distance. "Meralda." "Yes, Empress?" The moment Mordred called out, a succubus demon stepped forward. "Take Aina to the back line. Take some help with you to carry her things." Meralda blinked in slight confusion. Did she really need help for this? But her expression changed when Mordred passed over Aina's unconscious body. Succubi were known for their strong spirit pressure. But, as demons, they also had bodies stronger than the average human knight. And, Meralda in particular, was a hand-picked protector for the Demon Empress, so it wouldn't be a surprise if she was many times stronger than the average succubus. Yet even she nearly collapsed. Without a choice, Meralda listened to her Empress' words and quickly shuttled Aina away with the help of several others. Aina's breathing continued to grow more erratic, her body becoming almost scalding to the touch. Despite the fact the temperature of Camelot was quite mild, her body billowed with steam as though she might erupt at any moment. Meralda wasn't sure what she could do about this. She wasn't a healer. All she could do was move Aina to the back line and hope the medical professionals could do something for her. Noah and Niall watched as Aina was being taken away, but they didn't say a word. This already wasn't a situation where they could continue to push their luck. Arthur's gaze narrowed. Their armies were currently facing Noah's. To face City Lord White, they would have to maneuver and shift their vanguard around, but doing such a thing was easier said than done. At the very least, Camelot didn't have such good military structure. In such a situation, even a well-disciplined army would face issues. To make matters worse, they had all just come out of a long, hard-fought battle. The battlefield itself hadn't even been properly cleared yet. This was completely unlike White City's previous pattern. Usually they would only levy one attack a day. It was clear in hindsight now that they had done this on purpose. The good was that this army seemed to only be built of 500 or so men and women. The bad news, however, was that not only were all their ground units riding mounts, but they also had an aerial unit of more than 50 men and winged beasts. The combined army of Camelot, the Demon Empire and the Empire numbered almost 3,000. But White City wasn't made up of fools. Though it could be argued that the appearance of the Empire on this battlefield should be an unknown variable for White City, there was no way White City didn't have forward scouts, and, as such, it was equally impossible that they wouldn't already be aware of the Empire's presence. Yet they chose to charge forward regardless. Arthur unsheathed his sword, causing a shimmering blade to dance beneath the high sun. "Knights, on me." His roar shook the battlefield. Holy road. Arthur's spirit pressure surged as his knees bent. The land beneath his feet cracked as he rocketed forward, a road of golden light following him as he arched across the skies. In a single leap, he crossed into the no-man's land between Camelot's armies and White Cities. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. If the Empire still chose to attack them in situation, Camelot was all but finished. Noah watched this in silence, his gaze slowly shifting toward Mordred. But it seemed as though Mordred didn't have any intention of taking the same actions as her father. She continued to face Noah, waiting for him to make a decision. Noah remained silent as though he couldn't feel the rumbling ground and the growing oppressive aura. Without a word, his slow charge toward Mordred shifted directions. cutting an angle across the battlefield and toward White City's charging presence. At that same moment, the remaining 6 knights of the Round Table reacted to Arthur's call. They had to give the demon army and Camelot's army enough time to change face. Empress. Mordred shifted her gaze away, looking toward Meralda, who had come rushing back. What is it? Is the little girl all right? Yes. I've already passed her along to the medical units. Then what is the problem? Meralda sighed. White City is also attacking for Provost's barony as well. I just received a voice transmission report we're under siege. Mordred's jaw clenched. In truth, she didn't need to hear this report to know that this would happen. The moment the Empire came here, she knew that her empire was in danger. Though Mordred had returned home and regained a semblance of family, she couldn't just abandon the demons that had allowed her into their fold. The demon empire might not be her home anymore, but it was definitely theirs. A flicker of rage passed through Mordred's pupils. Did they really take her, the demon empress, so lightly? What's the situation? Your Majesty left Krakos in charge. He predicts that he can last about half a day before they have to retreat into the mountains once again. According to the report, there are at least 10 white knights on that battlefield. 10. Mordred's brow furrowed deeper. According to what they knew, there were only 16 to begin with. One of them had been killed by Lionel, so there was only 15. For 10 to be on that battlefield, it was clear that this was all planned out from the very beginning. The worst part of all of this was that it couldn't be forgotten that this moon was a sphere. If White City conquered the Demon Empire, it would be as good as gaining 2 footholds to demolish Camelot with. A dark aura surged around Mordred, causing Meralda to shiver. At that moment, Meralda's talisman glowed once again. Leave it to me, Em. Mordred's rage suddenly dissipated with the wind. That voice, wasn't that Lionel? He was on the Provost battlefield? Why was he there? Did he already predict this? Don't worry, he'll send them packing soon. Mordred could almost see Lionel's grin through the talisman, his air of confidence hanging palpably in the air. Chapter 473. Mordred hesitated, a slight air of guilt hanging around her. She knew, almost better than the man himself, how much Lionel cared about Aina. She felt like she should tell Lionel about Aina's current condition. But at the same time, she knew that Lionel was about to do something foolish again. If he was distracted by other thoughts, his life would definitely be in more danger. Unfortunately, due to the fact Mordred hesitated, Lionel had already disconnected before she could make a final decision, leaving her at a loss. Empress. Meralda's call woke Mordred from her stupor. At that moment, Noah and Arthur were already about to clash with the front line of White City's army. Mordred's lost expression became steely, a baleful aura swirling around her. Vast amounts of dark elemental force surged, her black dress fluttering in the wind. Her slender fingers wrapped around a wand as her figure rose into the air. She walked toward the clouds as though the shadows were her stairway to heaven. If Lionel had been here, he would have recognized this ability as being near identical to Little Blackstar's own. Maybe it shouldn't be a surprise that the Demon Empress had become Shadow Sovereign. Whether or not she was a true Shadow Sovereign or not remained to be seen. But what was most definitely true was that she had tapped into the same magic system as the Little Mink. Still, if the outside world knew that Earth had potentially produced 2 Shadow Sovereigns in the same generation, who knew how they'd react? Those that can fly with me. Mordred's voice wasn't as booming as her father's. In fact, it carried the delicate touch of a woman. Yet it felt no less imposing and grand. It felt as though her commands were irrefutable. At that moment, several demons with bat-like wings shot into the skies under the behest of their queen, tearing a path toward White City's aerial units. Though fatigue was clear in their demeanors, the strength their empress displayed gave them a second wind. They were prepared to follow her to the death. Meralda took several deep breaths on the ground, squeezing her long legs together tightly. Her expression seemed completely inappropriate for the occasion, but what else could you expect from a succubus? She licked her lips, watching Mordred's bottom sway as she stepped into the skies. The Empress is truly too enticing. These damned White City warriors? Meralda felt frustrated. She wanted nothing more than to ravage the Empress right then and there. But with this battle underway, she had no ability to do so. It seemed that her only choice would be to wipe this army and their city lord out first. Demonic heralds of darkness, charge. Meralda's half-excited voice caused the blood of the male demons to surge, her hypnotic suggestion being several times more powerful now than they would be in any other situation. As though maddened beasts, the demons roared into the skies, their savage bearings clashing against White City's momentum. And then the armies met. "Are you sure that you can battle?" Krako's deep and oddly intellectual voice drifted to Lionel's ears. Huh. Lionel's head snapped up as though he had just woken from a nap. But his reaction only made the number one demon lord even more anxious. Unlike what his confident voice had projected out before, the current Lionel was in a sorry state. He wasn't injured at all. In fact, his body didn't have a scratch on it. But other than that, he looked terrible. Not only did he smell awful, something that was quite surprising to someone like Krakos who had grown up around demons all his life, the bags beneath his eyes were so heavy that they almost formed new layers of skin all to their own. Rivaling even the worst demons, and poor hygiene was one matter, but the young man couldn't even keep his eyes open. How exactly was he going to battle? It even seemed like he had sapped up all his remaining energy projecting that confident air to Mordred. After that, he had nothing left to give. "Oh yes. Lionel nodded almost too slowly. "Everything will be fine." Krakos' brow furrowed. At the moment, the demons had only one advantage: the terrain. Whereas Camelot, the Empire and Mordred's troops were currently fighting on endless plains, Krakos had made the decision to retreat to the first line of mountains between No Man's Land and the Demon Empire. But even with this advantage, it might not be enough. According to the scouts, there were more aerial units coming. And whereas the army led by City Lord White was only made of 500, this one numbered 2,000. They simply weren't properly equipped to deal with such a thing. Lionel's head nodded and he almost fell over before he caught himself, shaking his head awake again. "Here." Lionel shoved a spatial ring at Krakos' chest. But due to their difference in height, Lionel's hand landed on Krakos' abdomen instead. "Take these and distribute one of each to the army." "This." Krakos' expression changed after his internal sight swept throughout the ring. He was initially going to say something, but he was once again distracted by the state of Lionel's hands. If it wasn't for the fact he was sure Lionel was human, he would have thought that he was actually a zombie demon. Were these really the hands a healthy teenage boy should have? Krakos cleared his throat and peeled Lionel's hand off of his abdomen by pinching two of his fingers around Lionel's wrist. "I know that you're a growing boy, but you should really take it easy on the extracurricular activities. Her Majesty has plenty of willing demonesses you can choose from that have quite a favorable impression of you." Lionel didn't even hear Krakos' words, his head nodding to sleep again before snapping awake. Yes, you're right, whatever," Lionel mumbled. Krakos sighed and walked away. Youths these days. Chapter 474. They've already retreated? An army of 2,000 strong marched forward. Despite the lack of enemies before them, their formation remained neat and organized. In fact, other than the unique sound of synchronized footsteps, the army had been completely silent until this point. At the helm of it all, the warrior who spoke wore black robes accented with white flexible armor. He rode on a scaled horse Lionel would easily recognize as the steeds Era and the other members of the Kefir family had been using when they first ran across him. Of course, the 10 individuals who headed this army were the White Knights of White City. Each of them rode upon one of these scaled horses, their demeanor stoic. It almost seemed out of place for any one of them to speak at all. Among them, 4 were women and the remaining 6 were men. "They've likely retreated to the first line of mountains." Another White Knight replied indifferently. "Where they've retreated to doesn't matter. Their death is imminent." The White Knights continued forward as though none of them had spoken a word to begin with. With barely a shred of communication, they shifted the direction the army was headed in, making a straight line toward the first line of defense. It was not even a couple hours later that the first line of mountains came into view for the White City army. Sitting atop a mountain peak, Lionel's head nodded to sleep every so often. Yip. The little mink lightly clawed at Lionel's face, waking him up. "Oh, are they here?" Lionel asked. Lionel's gaze seemed somewhat sharper. Though the fatigue was still there, it seemed that he had at least rested his mind a bit. But whether it would make much of a difference still remained to be seen. Lionel looked over the horizon. Though Camelot's lands had been dispelled of the perpetual rain, No Man's Land and the Demon Empire still had heavy dark clouds hanging over it, a very familiar light drizzle of acidic rain pitter-pattering ever so softly. From Lionel's vantage point, high up on a mountain peak, he could see the gray cracked lands White City's army marched through. Lionel stood a bit too quickly, causing his head to spin. More than 30 hours of sleep wasn't enough? Lionel grasped onto his head, sighing lightly. It had technically only been 2 hours of sleep. But, split between his minds thanks to dream sense, it should have been the equivalent of more than 30. Unfortunately, it seemed that Lionel had underestimated just how much time he would need for his mind to recover. This state should still be more than enough to deal with them. Lionel's gaze grew cold, a calculating indifference reflecting in his eyes. Hold. The acting commander of the White City troops held up a palm. She gazed calmly toward the looming mountains without an ounce of panic. Though they had been constantly sending cannon fodder to the battlefields up to this point, that didn't mean their elites were standing idly by. In fact, they had already thought through their plan of attack thoroughly. Facing this mountain, the acting commander, White Knight Fariolus, already had everything mapped out in her mind. However, the mark of a true commander wasn't so simple. Generals all began by studying the battles of their predecessors before they got the chance to come to the battlefield on their own. But, generals who restricted themselves based on what they had read on what were ultimately dead pieces of paper would be forever destined to not reach the pinnacle of warring masters. Fariolus immediately felt that something was off just by laying her eyes on the mountain. There were 3 paths up this mountain and there was no easy way to travel between them, at least not in large groups. The advantage of the demons was obviously being able to prepare in advance and having such great terrain to work with. But the advantage for White City was that the demons would have no idea which paths they would pick. The obvious choice for the demons, then, was to destroy 2 of the paths. Due to their narrow and not very safe to begin with structures, this task would have been very easy. This way they would easily eliminate White City's first advantage by forcing them down a single path. This would have been the perfect plan. Destroying all 3 paths would have shot the Demon Empire in the foot as well. After all, they also needed a path out. So, 2 was the perfect balance of hurting the enemy while helping themselves. Of course, White City had already been prepared for this. As a counter, they had hidden mechanisms within their supply units that would actually allow them to fly over the mountains entirely and assault the palace from the skies. Though the mountainous structures appeared to be terrible from the outside, the location of the Demon Empress Palace was actually a flat of the mountainous land and, not unlike a castle, acted as its own city. But the problem was that the obvious action the demons should have taken by destroying the 2 paths hadn't been taken at all. From the outside, this seemed to be a good thing. It should have meant that their enemies were more foolish than they thought. But was this really the case? According to their intelligence, the demons were no less intelligent than humans. In fact, even if they weren't, their empress was a human who should have easily been able to think of this. Could it be that they want to begin the battle on the next mountain range? Did they retreat further back than we assumed? Fariolus thought that there was a good possibility that this could be the case. After all, this initial mountain pass only led to the main mountain range the Demon Palace could be found. However, if this was the case, their plans would definitely be less effective as the palace would be heavily guarded. Compared to Camelot, the Demon Empire had many more aerial options available to them thanks to the variability of demonkind. Interesting. Fariolus's lip curled. Begin Phase 1. My troop, Roa's troop, Cannon's troop, and Borg's troop will not participate, will be going up the mountain on foot. White City's warriors got to work immediately, not doubting Fariolus's judgment despite the fact it went against everything they had prepared for. Soon, massive platforms that almost looked like enlarged hot air balloon baskets soared into the air, each carrying dozens of warriors beneath the beating wings of massive birds of prey. At the same time, Fariolus led a troop of the remaining 1,000 on the ground and toward the middle mountain pass, her heart thumping with a will for battle. Chapter 475. So that's their choice? Lionel watched this all happen from afar. It seemed odd that he could see things happening from tens of kilometers away so clearly, but it didn't seem like a problem for him in the slightest. Krakos, lead your men down the middle pass of the mountain. Lionel seemed to speak to empty air. There wasn't a single soul on the mountain peak except for himself. Yet, in the instant he spoke, Krakos' men had moved out under his command. There are 5 white knights in the group you're headed for. All 5 of them have strength surpassing your own, so be sure to follow my orders to a point. Fariolus thought that the demons were planning something secretive due to their odd actions, when the reality was that Lionel didn't have a large overarching plan. What he did have were many trump cards he was ready to deploy at a moment's notice. The first of these trump cards was Lionel's own personal force disruption towers. To everyone, including those of terrain, force disruption towers had become impossible to use. This only made sense. As the world evolved, the laws of physics that governed it would also fundamentally change. By the current age of technology, the pieces of engineering the people of Earth relied on were inextricably linked to concepts of chemistry, complex studies of physics, and even in some cases biology. In such a case, as these laws changed, the technology created to make use of them also became useless. Unless Earth adapted to the new changes with new creations of technology every time they evolved, tech would only become more and more useless as time went on. However, Lionel wasn't restricted to Earth's technology at all. Just 2 or so months ago, Lionel had witnessed the engineers of Royal Blue Fort attempt to piece together a force disruption tower. Though they had failed to complete it in the end, Lionel had already taken note of all of the tower's pieces. With the level his mind had reached and the fact the towers were created based on third-dimensional constructs, memorizing everything with a glance was as easy as breathing for Lionel. After witnessing everything, it only became a matter of reverse engineering it all. However, even then, Lionel didn't need to go so far. What he needed wasn't a true working force disruption tower. After all, they had become nearly useless after Earth entered the fourth dimension. No, what Lionel needed was just a framework, a push in the right direction, a small light at the end of the tunnel. That would be enough to bring the warriors of White City hell. Fariolus led the vanguard through the mountain pass. Rock walls surrounded them from all directions, almost as though they had entered a dark valley rather than a passage up a mountain. Though the passage was considered narrow, this was only in consideration for an army of 1,000 strong. The truth was that there was still 20 meters of clearance between the walls of the mountain pass. Still, with an army of this size, such a reality made quickly retreating almost an impossibility. But Fariolus wasn't a fool. She was already prepared for any unexpected situations. The reality was that whenever you were an army laying siege, losses would be inevitable. She entered this pass knowing very well that it might be a trap, but she was prepared to suffer whatever consequences might come with it. This was the philosophy of the White City Knights. They as commanders rode in the vanguard. They as commander took the brunt of the pressure on their shoulders. They as commanders would face all danger that came their way. It was this top-down philosophy that bred the fearless army of White City. When your commanders dared to lead the charge, what right did they as subordinates have to cower? Fariolus's gaze narrowed. The ground only shifted a bit, but she sensed it. Her sensitivity to such things was beyond normal limits, not only due to her experience as a commander, but most importantly due to her ability. This was the second reason she dared to enter this narrow passageway. Fariolus's ability made her exceptionally sensitive to vibrations through the ground. But what shocked her wasn't the fact there were vibrations, but rather that these vibrations were so normal. This rhythm, it could only come from an advancing troop. Fariolus internally sneered. It couldn't be that they wanted to meet on this battlefield, right? Had she really overthought it? Did the demons just overestimate themselves? Though the report said that the demons were just as intelligent as humans, it also said that they were quite hot-blooded as well. They may very well be like their City Lord White, but completely lacking in the strength City Lord White had. Still, though Fariolus thought this, she went on her guard, stopping the army at one of the many winding paths. This is the best location to meet them. The current location had the White City army still moving uphill, which put them at a slight disadvantage. But, in return, the bend in the path more than made up for this. The vast majority of people were right-handed. This was the case across the universe and across races. The position Fariolus chose to stop at gave those with a dominant right hand the advantage. But this was only a small part of the puzzle. The main reason Fariolus chose this location was because the demon army would have to curl around the path to meet them, whereas White City's army could meet them head-on. If the demons were really as hot-headed as they seemed, they would easily fall into this small trap. Fariolus pulled out a sword while unsheathing a dagger with her left. This was her in her optimal state. 1.5-meter length sword in her right and a short sword in her left. She had lost count of the number of enemies she had slaughtered with these two blades. They stopped. Fariolus's gaze narrowed. It seemed she was correct to be cautious. A battle intent exuded from her body. Without a single word, the warriors to her back felt her excitement, their blood beginning to boil as well. Activate it now. Lionel's expressionless voice shook Krakow's heart. Was this the same boy he had just been with? But, without hesitation, Krakos gave the hand signal. In unison, the demons brandished their weapons, pouring all the force they could muster into them. In that instant, the quality of the air seemed to shift. The mountain pass gained an abnormal stillness. Charge! Lionel commanded. A long distance away, in a military recovery tent on the Camelot battlefield, Aina tossed and turned, her breathing short and ragged. Strong pulsing veins coursed through her body, bulging throughout her neck. The military tent soared past 100 degrees Celsius and seemed to still be climbing. Chapter 476. City Lord White held a combat prowess those of Earth had simply never seen before. If it wasn't for Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, Noah and Jessica all surrounding her at once, it felt like she could solo the entire battlefield on her own. Yet even with so many working together, she didn't seem to be even slightly disadvantaged. In fact, she even held the upper hand, her strength causing the skies to tremble and the earth to quake. City Lord White swung Clara with a single hand, sending King Arthur flying backward. Arthur's feet dug a deep pit in the ground, his body sinking down into a strong horse stance as he held Excalibur across his body. City Lord White's irises glittered somewhat. She was inwardly shocked, not because of the strength of the enemies she faced, but rather because of the quality of their weapons. Logically speaking, it was impossible for such a fledgling world to have such powerful weapons. Their weakness should also come with an appropriate lack of resources. Yet this wasn't the case at all. In fact, if it wasn't for White City being severely outclassed in weaponry, this war might have come to an end long ago. Just as an example, there was the sword in Arthur's hands. It shouldn't have been able to survive even a single strike from her before shattering. Yet, not only did it not show any signs of collapsing, it was even faintly putting pressure on her double-headed weapon. As though that wasn't bad enough, there was Arthur's white armor. Though City Lord White wasn't a weapons expert, she could still tell that Arthur's armor reinforced his force and deflected almost 10% of her attacks. If it wasn't for her sturdy build, City Lord White would have suffered a great deal. If it was just Arthur, things might have been fine. But there was still Noah's saber and Jessica's whip. In fact, even the Knights of the Round Table all had weapons and armor superior to her own. This was especially the case for Lancelot and his golden lance. It felt that if she was even a little careless, she would be pierced all the way through. On terrain, such weapons simply didn't exist. Though worlds could have heirlooms they passed down at this quality, and being in her position, City Lord White would definitely be in position to have one such weapon, it had to be remembered that terrain was deemed as a world without talent. As a result of this, terrain never received the support of higher dimensional worlds and as such never received rewards for their zones. The only benefit of clearing zones for terrain was helping their world to survive another day and maybe the training they could receive by putting their lives on the line. This was the reality of the world. There was no such thing as fairness. Terrain didn't receive the support of higher dimensional worlds because they weren't talented. By the same token, these higher dimensional worlds had no obligation to help Earth either. Like this, City Lord White faced enemies with Tier 9 black and quasi-bronze treasures all around while she herself only wielded a Tier 7 black treasure she treated like her own child. Yet, despite the situation, a maddening grin hung across her attractive face. Her slender arms bulged with strength it shouldn't have, blasting another 2 Knights of the Round Table away. Come, show me more. I haven't bled in a long time, can you let me see the color of my blood? City Lord White's laughter rang throughout the battlefield. Her voice was like a beacon in the darkness for her men, constantly fueling their momentum. How could their blood not boil? Even when so many faced their commander at once, they were simply no match for her. Noah brandished his blue-bladed saber. If those who weren't aware of his ability saw him now, they would be stunned. Normally, Noah was just around 2 meters tall. But now, he stood at over 5, his body exuding the valiant air of a god descended from the skies. His blade increased in size with him, swinging down at City Lord White with a might that made the wind tremble. Good. City Lord White flicked her wrist upward, easily deflecting Noah's saber as though it was no heavier than a feather. She reset herself, looking to swing at and shatter Noah's knee, but Jessica reacted quickly, causing several demonic beasts to pounce at the City Lord. However, City Lord White's sinister grin only grew wider. As though it put no pressure on her wrists at all, she easily shifted her aim with a thought, shattering the skulls of 3 beasts with a single flicker. Noah felt as though his arm was about to shatter beneath the she-devil's counterattack. His ability wasn't as simple as gigantification. He could increase the size of his body in any object he so chose, but he could also control density along with this ability. Everyone knew that volume increased by a cubic while surface area increased by a square. This meant that there was a limit to how large the human body could become before it collapsed in on itself. However, Noah could bypass this by increasing the density of his bones several-fold at will. Even making his bones as strong as diamond wasn't impossible with his current ability. In the future, making himself as durable as a fourth-dimensional or higher metals would just be a thought away. This was all to say that Noah could make his own weight increase to an inconceivable degree, and he would also be able to proportionally increase his muscle density to have the strength to back it up. Yeah. City Lord White deflected it all with a flick of her wrist. At that moment, King Arthur dug himself out of the trench he had slid back in, charging back toward City Lord White with the same valiant air. Golden lights surged around his body, dancing along with his blade as he cleaved forward. City Lord White's laughter sounded as she sent him flying once more. In the blink of an eye, she appeared amidst the knights of the Round Table, forcing them to quickly defend themselves. But the result was only to be expected. Blood flew from their lips as they were sent flying. City Lord White shot forward, appearing before King Arthur, her double-headed hammer already swinging downward, a manic laughter hanging in the air. King Arthur's visage remained stoic, slamming a palm into the ground and flipping out of the way. However, City Lord White's nimbleness was beyond his comprehension. With a twist of her wrist, her target changed like flowing water, aimed right for King Arthur's head. Arthur's gaze sharpened, the scent of death hanging over him. He could almost feel the Grim Reaper whispering into his ears. With the quickest movements he could muster, he rose Excalibur to his face, trying to block it. City Lord White's laughter didn't pause for even a moment. She could almost smell the blood spraying into the air. It was at that moment that a strong surge of magic shook the battlefield. A shield of ice quickly formed in the path of City Lord White's hammer, causing it to slow and pause just for a moment before being shattered. By then, King Arthur had already taken advantage of the opportunity to dodge out of the way, City Lord White's hammer just scraping a hair's breadth from his head. In the distance, the blue eyes of Queen Guinevere shone like two sparkling sapphire gems. The Queen of Camelot had stepped onto the battlefield for the first time in decades. Chapter 477. Queen Guinevere's spirit pressure seemed to make the skies bow down. It was only at this moment that the people of Camelot and the Demon Empire realized that the strongest mage of Camelot wasn't the Pope, nor was it Arthur, nor was it even Mordred. It was the Queen of the people, Guinevere Pendragon. Ho ho. Good. The more the merrier. City Lord White's laughter continued, brandishing her hammer to smash toward King Arthur again as though she hadn't sensed Guinevere's presence in the least. Sharp, icy winds spun around the queen, her black hair rapidly becoming coated in a thin layer of ice. In an instant, her tan skin and black hair became as white as snow, her eyes becoming such a pale shade of blue that they too seemed to become white. Several javelins of ice formed to her back, shattering the sound barrier as they shot forward. The mages of Camelot immediately reeled in shock. They couldn't wrap their minds around how the queen displayed such prowess without her wand. At that moment, City Lord White became more serious. She wasn't a well-informed person. All she knew was battle. If it wasn't related to brandishing her hammer, she didn't want to hear about it. But what she did have were instincts honed over countless years of endless battle. So, though she didn't know the name of the exact innate force node Queen Guinevere had awakened, she knew that it couldn't be a weak one. Ha! City Lord White swung her hammer toward the incoming ice javelins. The shattering of ice resounded through the battlefield, gorgeous snowflakes wildly fluttering at the point of contact. Under the astonished gazes of many, City Lord White took a single step back. Though it was just one, it filled King Arthur and the others with fighting spirit. This wild she-devil had finally shown a weakness. In the skies, Mordred finally sighed a breath of relief. When Arthur almost died, she felt her heart seize. She never thought that she would have such a strong reaction to the almost death of her father. It seemed that blood was truly thicker than water. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to come down from the skies. If she let the aerial units of White City run rampant, this battle would be over as soon as it started. Luckily, her mother had come to the battlefield. Under normal circumstances, King Arthur would never allow her to. In fact, the only reason he allowed Mordred to battle at all was because he didn't really have a choice. After all, she was the ruler of the demons. If she wasn't here, who would take command of them exactly? There was a reason Leonis couldn't be found on the battlefield. Guinevere's appearance caused the landscape of the war to shift once again. City Lord White was constantly placed on her back foot, her hammer deflecting Guinevere's barrage of ice javelins. Guinevere's ranged assault put even Lionel to shame. To be able to put so much power into each strike, it was well beyond anything the current Lionel could do. It was hard to believe that Camelot still had such a trump card in the wings. It seemed that the awakening of Guinevere's ability made her powerful beyond belief. Taking advantage of Guinevere keeping City Lord White pinned down, the others began to act as well, pincering the City Lord from all sides. King Arthur activated Light Domain, sending a barrage of light projectiles toward City Lord White as well. Noah brandished his saber, using the openings Queen Guinevere created to send out strikes of his own. In the blink of an eye, it seemed as though everything had flipped on its head. Even City Lord White's laughter seemed to have come to a grinding halt. However, those who assaulted her didn't seem capable of relaxing even for a moment. No, it wasn't that they weren't capable but rather that they couldn't. City Lord White's laughter may have come to a close, but the look on her face sent shivers down all of their spines. Her grin became wider and wider, a sinister darkness cascading over her face. The solemn atmosphere of the battlefield seemed to grow several-fold. It was as though City Lord White's lack of laughter was even more of a sign than her actual laughter had been. And the only ones who seemed to be in the dark about this were the experts locked in battle with her. Good. Now I can finally go all out. In the distance, Naya watched on, a clipboard being hugged against her chest. She shook her head, lamenting the state of things. It would have been better if they were too weak, at least then City Lord wouldn't truly go berserk. Naya sighed. How will we reel her in this time? Naya began to rack her brain. As far as she was concerned, this battle was as good as over. She only hoped that her City Lord didn't sink too far in this time. Blood. City Lord White's cry almost manifested like a banshee's. It was a shrill shriek that could cause one's blood to curdle and one's heart to stop. At that moment, City Lord White's short hair suddenly began to wildly grow. In the blink of an eye, it became like a river of crimson floating in the air. What was even more shocking, though, was the change to her eyes. In a moment, the whites of her eyes became a blood red, while her irises became a murky gray. No matter how one looked at her, she looked like a demon incarnate. But, as though to ensure those who didn't think so saw through to the truth of the situation, corpses from all around the battlefield trembled. Then, in the blink of an eye, they were completely drained, streams of blood from their dead bodies shooting into the air and pouring into City Lord White's hair as though to nurture it. Blood. City Lord White's laughter once again sounded, but this time, it felt as though 3 women were laughing at once, then it was 4, then 5. Very soon, it was impossible to tell that they were women at all. When everyone realized what was happening, their eyes widened in shock. It wasn't City Lord White's laughter anymore at all. In fact, other than the mad grin on her face, City Lord White's mouth didn't open at all. The laughter, it was coming from the blood. It was the voices of the dead piercing through the veil of the living as though to remind them all not to forget. City Lord White shot forward, her speed more than triple what it had been before. In less than a breath, she appeared before Lancelot, her hammer swinging forth. Lancelot reacted as quickly as he could, piercing forward and up with his lance. But a vibrant red glow that pulsed like a beating heart appeared on City Lord White's hammer as it smashed downward. At the instant of contact, Lancelot felt pain like he never had before. The bones in his legs collapsed in on themselves, what remained of his knee piercing through his skin in gruesome fashion. All the strength he had accumulated seemed to be no better than a child swinging with all their might at an adult. In all his life, Lancelot had never felt so weak, nor had he ever suffered through such pain. Lancelot! Arthur, Guinevere and the Knights of the Round Table all shouted in rage at once. But City Lord White's laughter was like a melodious tune being plucked to their suffering. At that moment, within a military healing tent, the temperature had already skyrocketed past 200 degrees Celsius. The heartbeat of the young girl had grown so loud that it could be heard even outside the flapping curtains. It was in that instant that her eyes shot open, reflecting a blinding golden light. Blood! The voice was soft, but it seemed to reach the ears of every person on the battlefield. Chapter 478. A year ago, Aina stood from her seated position, power she had never felt before coursing through her veins. She had already expected that the blood of a fifth-dimensional creature would give her a massive boost to her strength, but she was still somewhat surprised that it allowed her to directly shatter the barrier to the fourth dimension. The fourth dimension was different from the third. It could be said that both planes of existence laid a foundation, but the method in which they did so was much different. In order to understand what this difference was, it had to be known that the minimum requirement for passing down a lineage factor was being in existence at the fourth dimension. Only upon gaining some mastery of this dimension would one reach the necessary threshold. The third dimension formed one's force nodes. The number one managed to form would remain unchanged, at least for the time being. This made one's success within the third dimension a direct predictor of one's success in the future. The fourth dimension built upon this foundation. Not only did one transition from third dimensional to fourth dimensional force, but one also began the process of body refinement. Though it seemed like dimensions were just power levels, this wasn't the case at all. When transitioning between dimensions, one was quite literally ascending to a new plane of existence. This was why the gap between dimensions was impossible to cross. The third dimension allowed one to create fourth-dimensional constructs within one's body, the force nodes. While the fourth dimension was the process of dispelling what impurities remained of the third and fourth dimensions to allow a smooth transition into the fifth dimension. At the fifth dimension, this was where the true powerful existences of the dimensional verse began to appear. As such, there was one main goal of the fourth dimension: to purify. Whether that be the blood, the bones, the organs. Everything needed to be cleansed of filth lingering from lesser dimensions. Only by doing this would it be possible to ascend to a higher level of being. However, unlike the third dimension, there wasn't just one method of completing this requirement. In fact, the fourth dimension was where the numerous diverging paths of the dimensional verse truly began to shine. For someone like Aina, the path she would choose was very simple. With her ability, it only made sense to focus on her blood. The blood was the life liquid the remainder of the body relied on. There wasn't a single crevice one could find in the body where it wasn't a major player. And, thanks to Aina's affinities and her ability, this was also among the easiest paths for her to take. As for how the power level of the fourth dimension worked, this was much more straightforward. In order to transition from the use of third-dimensional force to fourth-dimensional force, the body had to be properly primed. Only by ridding oneself of these impurities would one be able to truly begin to use fourth-dimensional force. Upon reaching the first tier, one would be able to fill one of their force nodes with fourth-dimensional force. Upon reaching the second tier, one would be able to withstand the filling of two force nodes with fourth-dimensional force. So on and so forth. However, one can easily see from this how divisions might be caused due to one's level of success within the third dimension. Not only were the sizes of everyone's force nodes different, but even the amount of force nodes one formed weren't all consistently the same. This meant that two individuals who could be considered Tier 1 fourth-dimensional existences could be of vastly different strengths. And the effort they had to put in to reach this level would definitely vastly differ as well. But only upon reaching Tier 1 would one truly be considered a fourth-dimensional existence. As though all of this wasn't complicated enough, the universe seemed to hate making things neat and tidy. By now, those with sharp minds would have realized that though forming large force nodes and reaching the maximum level of 9 gave one an advantage, it would also be easy to realize that this didn't restrict one from continuing to purify one's body. Even if you only formed 3 force nodes and could already sustain fourth-dimensional force in them all, what was stopping you from continuing to refine and purify your body? For example, compared to Lionel, Aina's force nodes were much smaller, not even close to Lionel's 100 cell size. And though she had managed to form 9 of them, her talent in energy manipulation was low due to her lack of talent with internal sight. Unfortunately, both of these things would be linked. However, compared to others, Aina's talent in refining her body were leagues beyond. Lionel could only rely on his lineage factor to match her in this regard. What did all of this mean? It meant that technically, one could have a poor showing and set a terrible foundation within the third dimension, yet still become an undefeatable existence within the fourth dimension. Aina was one such person. Though her foundation within the third dimension couldn't be considered to be bad, it wasn't among the very best either. However, her talent for growth within the fourth dimension was beyond what most could fathom. In fact, without having spent even a single minute within the fourth dimension, Aina had already cleared the requirements to be considered a Tier 2 fourth-dimensional existence. Of course, this was mostly in thanks due to the abyssal panther blood she just ingested. That said, how many others could ingest fifth-dimensional blood in the third and live to tell about it? Aina flexed her body, basking beneath the popping of her joints. Other than the discomfort her inflamed scars were bringing her, she had never felt more at ease in her life. Her blood thrummed and her heart gave out long and steady beats. She felt as though she could shatter the world with a single fist. It's time for me to find a path out of here. Though Tier 2 fourth-dimensional strength is good, they were at least at Tier 4 or 5 in strength. Aina's Tier 2 strength was likely worth more than a usual Tier 3 existence on terrain due to the size of her force nodes. Though she couldn't compare to Lionel, that didn't mean she lost out to those with such poor talent. But, leaping over any more would be troublesome, at least when she was facing so many of them at once. Plus, there were other factors to strength than just one's base powerful level like styles and embryos. Aina still needed to train herself more. So, she traveled deeper into the cave, not knowing a thing about the horrible experience that lied in wait for her. Chapter 479. The people of Terrain say that the Mountain Sands Range was a forbidden zone. It gained its name because according to legend, the deeper one traveled into this mountain range, the more difficult it became to leave. Unfortunately, when she entered this mountain range, Aina had no idea about this. Due to her hasty teleportation, rather than being sent to a proper city like Lionel had, she appeared in the wilderness where she just so happened to stumble across a variant zone. Due to the nature of a variant zone, Aina managed to claim rewards despite her competitors being several times more powerful. But this made her escape all the more difficult. Without a choice, she charged into the mountain range and eventually managed to find this network of tunnels. Knowing it wasn't safe to go back the way she came, believing that those three heirs were still chasing her, Aina instead decided to find a secluded location to break through. Now she was hoping to find an alternate exit. Unlike Lionel, Aina didn't have perfect recall nor did she have a powerful mind. This wasn't to say that she wasn't intelligent, but rather that she wasn't as much of a monster in this regard as compared to Lionel. After all, Lionel's mind could probably put a supercomputer of the 25th century to shame. Without a choice, Aina could only travel forward slowly, leaving marks on the walls of the caves traveled through to remind her of where she had been and whether she was traveling in circles or not. Luckily, Aina had the small sword she gained from the variant zone. It was much more convenient to use than her massive axe in such small quarters. Author's note: yes, small sword. Note that Aina's great sword has not appeared yet at this point. By now, Aina had long since placed her sensory-boosting headpiece on. Before, she had been hesitant to do so. Compared to Lionel, she was much more informed about the situation of other worlds. So, she was very much aware how much of a draw a quasi-bronze treasure could be. As such, she hid the fact she had won while within the variant zone. But now that she had become the enemy of those three anyway, even if she ran into them now, it wouldn't make much of a difference. After all, the blood of a fifth-dimensional entity could be considered about equal to a quasi-bronze treasure. In fact, to the right person, it would be even more valuable. The force is getting denser? Aina's brows raised, a faint excitement in her heart. If force was increasing in the direction she was walking, it was very likely that there could be treasures lying in wait. It wasn't rare for such ancient networks of caves to have untapped mines. Aina continued to mark the walls she came across with arrows, maintaining her caution. Usually, the most sensitive creatures to shifts in force density weren't humanoids but rather beasts and invalids. Though invalids only cared about devouring humans, beasts were different. Whether it was humans or resources, they would be interested in both. It wouldn't be a surprise if a beast called this place home. As Aina approached the location of the increased force density, she heard a faint scratching noise that caused her steps to freeze. Though Aina's senses weren't very powerful, thanks to her strong body, what she did have was great hearing and eyesight. In fact, after absorbing the Abyssal Panther's blood, her ability to see in the darkness was no worse than her ability to see in the light, which was very helpful in this dark environment. There's something up ahead, Aina crouched, slinking forward as though she truly was a panther. The light in her amber eyes seemed to dim toward a darker hue and gained a more feline look to them. Her black hair melded into the darkness as she quickly darted forward, making it to the small branching pathway the noise was coming from. After peeking inside, Aina was stunned by what she saw. An invalid. Aina's heartbeat quickened slightly before she forced it to enter another slow and calming rhythm. She was well aware that any invalids that managed to survive this long on a world that had long since gone through its metamorphosis wasn't an existence she could look down upon. But, at the same time, such invalids would leave behind great stores of energy. Whenever an invalid was killed, they would become the purest globule of force imaginable. When this was absorbed, it would be a great boon to a body. The stronger the invalid was, the greater the benefit would be as well. The only unfortunate thing, or maybe fortunate in this case, was that Terrain was a world without much talent. Though invalids that survived this long would indeed be powerful, they still had a limit on just how powerful they could become. Invalids had an exceptionally difficult time traveling between worlds for obvious reasons. So, if all they could devour were low-talent humans, they'd be equally as pitiful. Aina brandished her sword, prepared to strike at any moment. What is it scratching and clawed? Aina had never seen an invalid act in this way. They would usually be placid and without emotion. Their only goals in life was to devour other humans and evolve themselves. Something like an invalid being so interested in a wall was unheard of, even if said wall had a treasure lying behind it. Aina shook her head and removed all distracting thoughts. Invalids were incredibly sensitive to force, so she didn't dare to use it. But, with her strength, especially after tempering her blood once, she didn't need to. Just a single strike to the head. That would be enough to make sure this invalid never saw the light of day again. Aina's thighs flexed, her body crouching like a strung bow. Bang. The invalid froze, its scratching coming to a stop when it heard the noise. But, Aina had already appeared to its back, aiming a blade at the back of its skull. At that moment, the invalid's head suddenly spun 180 degrees, its placid white eyes locking onto Aina's approaching blade. Aina felt something grab at her heart as though trying to fill her with fear. But her blade never stopped, shooting through the invalid's skull in the next instant. The invalid's forehead was split by Aina's blade, but its eyes remained locked onto Aina as its life force dimmed. But just as it was about to fade into motes of light, its jaw went slack, hanging open at an awkward angle as though a wooden puppet with a loose screw. And then it screamed. The sound was so loud that Aina felt her eardrums shatter. But she didn't have the time to linger on the pain in the slightest. She felt that this scream hadn't been a normal scream, it was a signal and she was the subject of the information being sent. Chapter 480? Aina pulled her sword out quickly. She didn't quite understand what was happening. Shouldn't invalids be creatures of instinct? They shouldn't have any intelligence or sense of camaraderie. Something like signaling one's allies was a distinctly human trait. Sometimes beasts of higher intelligence would engage in such matters as well. But invalids? That should never happen. It didn't become energy? Aina was shocked once again. The invalid before her collapsed, but it didn't disappear into energy she could absorb. Just what was happening? Aina's heart seized. Did she make a mistake? Was it not an invalid at all? No, that was impossible. Its eyes, its aura, its demeanor, it all screamed invalid. So, what was happening exactly? Aina didn't believe that she would make such a rookie mistake. Plus, what existence other than an invalid could shriek like that even after having its head pierced through? Aina was certain, it hadn't been a shriek of pain or unwillingness. It had no emotion behind it all, it was completely hollow and without conscience. I need to move. Aina thrust these thoughts to the back of her mind, taking a glance at the wall the invalid had been scratching at. If Lionel had been there, he would immediately recognize the Tier 5 black ore embedded into the wall. It wasn't very valuable, but it wasn't worthless either. At the very least, it could sell for a couple kilograms of black herb Oregon. I don't have time to dig it out and it doesn't seem like a very high level ore either. Aina nodded to herself. Run. Without hesitation, Aina turned tail and ran. She felt it was unfortunate that she had placed herself in such a difficult situation for such a worthless or she couldn't even mine, but there was no time to cry over spilt milk. Aina shot back in the direction she came. She knew she didn't have enough time to run and create new markings on the wall. And if she got lost in these tunnels, there would be no one to come out and save her. Therefore, her best chance was to follow her arrows in reverse. If that screech was really a signal as she thought, then it likely meant that there were more invalids on their way. If she was correct, then her arrows wouldn't mean much if anything to them. With their low intelligence, she didn't need to worry about being followed. Aina rounded a corner with confidence, only to come to a grinding halt. There were 3 of them blocking her path, all of them with their backs facing her. But they all simultaneously rotated their heads in her direction as though they were nighttime owls. It was the kind of sight that sent shivers down one's spine. Aina hesitated, her jaw clenched. Should she go forward? Or run back? The former was the only way for her to continue following her arrows. But the latter would force her to forget her initial plans entirely. There was no way she would be able to keep a mental map of where she was going, and getting lost would be a near guarantee. This network of tunnels simply had too many diverging paths. If it wasn't for this, there was no way that Aina would only meet these invalids on her way back and never even sense them during her first trip down this passage. Aina grit her teeth. Forward. She knew that this was the best choice she had. If there were invalids on her way back, that only meant that she had been very lucky not to run into them on the way here. If that was the case, there might very well be even more if she headed in deeper rather than trying to exit. Her only way out of this situation was to leave this network of tunnels entirely. Aina's blood began to boil, a faint red hue covering her blade and her body. With a thought, she shot forward, brandishing her blade. The three invalids reacted all at once, but their reactions seemed disjointed. Though they were as fast as fourth-dimensional humans, their joints would often bend at odd angles as though they were double-jointed in all areas. They moved less like humanoids and more like some alien species just learning how to walk on their own 2 feet thanks to bodies they had snatched. The sight sent a cold shiver down Aina's back, but this was a good thing for her. The less coordinated they were, the greater chance she had of leaving this place. With a sweep of her blade, one lost an arm and a leg in quick succession. Without even bothering with the remaining 2, she shot by the gap she created after the invalid toppled over, nearly hitting her head on the ceiling of the cave as she soared by them. Aina pumped her legs as quickly as she could, no longer minding the noise she might make. As long as the invalids she came across continued to be so uncoordinated and slow, she just had to continue running with all her might. She rounded several corners, almost lamenting her previous actions. Why couldn't she have traveled in a straight line before? What possessed her to take so many turns? Aina ran into several more invalids. Many were alone, allowing her to easily bypass them. But a few came in groups of 2 and 3. Still, it wasn't beyond her means of dealing with. However, she grew more anxious the more she ran. How were there so many invalids here? Why did none of them become motes of light? Why were they all acting so weirdly? She couldn't fathom how there were so many here. The more she ran into, the more she began to question how she had traveled so deeply without running into even a single one. Damn it. Aina rounded another corner, only to run into several more invalids. But this time they numbered almost a dozen. Their odd interactions continued. As though they couldn't sense their comrades by their sides, they all tried to squeeze into the narrow tunnel at once. They pushed against each other, shifting to their sides as they continued to press forward. It should have been a comedic sight. Some of the invalids had their cheeks pressed flush against one another, others even had their noses squished as though they couldn't kiss each other deeply enough. But their emotionless gazes and their indifferent expressions sent a shiver down one's spine. It was as though they would stop at nothing until they devoured Aina. Aina clenched her teeth. She was so close. She could feel it. It had only taken her half an hour to travel as deeply as she did, but she had already been sprinting with all her might for almost 5 minutes. She knew that she must be closing in on the exit. But just when she had been, 11 invalids completely blocked her path forward. Continue. Aina wanted to press forward. She just had to get past this line and she would be free. Unfortunately, reality was cruel. Just when she took a step forward, she saw another wave of invalids coming between the cracks of the 11 that had squeezed themselves together. If they combined into one, their numbers would exceed 20. Aina's eyes flickered with a hint of helplessness. Without a choice, she shot into a diverging path, knowing full well that she was now lost. Chapter 481. The situation only seemed to continuously spiral more and more out of control. Without any direction, Aina continued traveling down the path of least resistance. What point was there in battling many invalids if she was no longer on the right path anymore to begin with? All she could do was try to head in the general direction she had aimed for in the very beginning, but without a map, compass, or strong sensory abilities, Aina was practically flying blind. Though she felt like she was headed in the right direction, for all she knew by now, she was already headed in the complete opposite. The headpiece Aina wore that almost took the shape of a loose crown on her head did have a strong boost to her abilities. But it was multiplicative, not additive. Since Aina's senses were weak to begin with, the effect of the treasure wasn't as great as it would be to someone with true sensory abilities. However, it was still very helpful in clearing Aina's mind. Despite the situation, she managed to remain calm, brandishing her sword toward her enemies and maintaining a steady control over her heart rate and stamina. She didn't know how long she would have to run and hide. But what she did know was that since the density of invalids could so quickly increase, it could very likely decrease back to what it once had been. She just had to keep running toward where the least of them appeared. As long as she ran for long enough, she felt she could finally break out of this encirclement. From her interactions with the invalids, their lack of intelligence was clear. She didn't believe that they would know to expand their encirclement to find her. Still, the situation just seemed off. Why did that invalid scream? Why were they acting so weirdly? In fact, to now, none of the invalids had even used their abilities. One of the most dangerous things about invalids should have been the unpredictable methods by which they made use of their powers. Yet, not a single one had taken advantage of this. Also, now that Aina thought about it, another hallmark of invalids, especially low-level ones, were failed mutations. They often had extra body parts or an odd assortment of a normal number of limbs. But all of these invalids looked normal? It was a silly thing to say considering their odd disjointedness. But compared to normal invalids, these ones looked almost too human. They had no odd mutations to speak of in the slightest if one wasn't thinking about their double-jointedness. Aina had no choice but to continue running for her life. But the situation only seemed to become more odd even as the density of force continued to skyrocket. Soon, Aina even felt as though the air quality was increasing and the quantity of oxygen was rising. Immediately she understood what this meant. Aina had entered the network of tunnels from a mountain peak she had climbed to. Obviously, so high up the oxygen density had plummeted. The only reason oxygen would be increasing was if she was headed down. It was at that moment that Aina realized she truly was lost. She thought she had been heading in the general direction of her exit all this time, hoping that she would run back into a path where she could find her drawn arrows again. But reality was cruel. She had ended up going in the complete opposite direction. Aina steeled her jaw, her gaze becoming icy. It no longer mattered. This wouldn't be the place she died. With a swing of her blade, another two invalids had their heads pierced through. She had too many things she needed to do. She had no intention of earning herself a nameless grave. With a flip in her mindset, this endless maze of tunnels and invalids became nothing more than another challenge Aina needed to cross. Every time her footsteps faltered or her arms grew tired, her resolve would be the light that burned brighter than everything else. Aina severed the arm of another invalid, her breathing ragged. She sidestepped its uncoordinated attempt to swipe at her, lopping off another head. A light? Aina rounded another corner, only to find a faint red light ahead. It spilled out from several diverging paths, making it difficult to tell just where the source of it was or if there were multiple different sources to begin with. Aina's chest heaved as she stepped over the corpse of the invalid before her. Though she wasn't sure if this would lead to more danger or not, in these monotonous tunnels, such a change was welcome. Even if there was more danger, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Aina felt that unlike the invalids she had come across before, these ones in particular seemed to share a purpose outside of devouring humans. If that was the case, then something had to be controlling them. If Aina could find and kill this person or thing, she may very well have an easier time finding a path out of here. With resolute steps, she made her way toward the brightest of the red lights, hoping this pathway carried the main source. She rounded another corner, cautiously making her way forward. A new invalid hasn't appeared in a while. Aina's chest grew tighter. In the past, she hadn't been able to travel even 50 meters without coming across another invalid. But now she had traveled several hundred without even hearing a single one. Aina's steps subconsciously slowed, her grip around her sword growing tighter as the red lights around her grew stronger. The crimson hue rebounded across the dark-walled cave, making some of the moisture clinging to it look no different from dripping blood. Aina stepped through another corridor, finding herself facing an opening to an open space. But it was difficult to see clearly through the bright red light. After so long in perpetual darkness, the sudden increase in intensity blinded her for a moment. However, before Aina could even care to about her blurred vision, her hair stood on end, her instincts screaming at her to run. Without hesitation she spun on her heel, looking to charge out. But it was at that moment that a lazy voice speaking in a language she couldn't understand drifted to her ear. At least that should have been the case. She wouldn't have understood had it not been for the added functionality of her jeweled headpiece coming into effect. "You've come such a long way, why leave now?" A shiver crawled up Aina's back. The voice was so soothing, it felt as though a devil was lingering over her shoulder, whispering sweet temptations to her. As though something was compelling her, Aina's body slowly turned back. Against her will, her feet moved, shuffling forward. She grit her teeth so hard that blood began to leak from her gums. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to make a difference. Aina crossed through the opening, her eyes finally adjusting to the scene before her. However, what she saw left her feeling so disgusted she almost dry heaved. It was a dinner table that extended dozens of meters. It was completely out of place in such a location. But it was what was on this dinner table that turned Aina's stomach inside out. Everywhere she looked, bits and pieces of human flesh could be found. Some were bones, some were beating hearts and trembling organs, there were even corpses that were only torso or others that were headless. At the helm of this table, a man sat with an indifferent expression, a head on the plate before him and a fork and knife in hand. With a single motion of his wrist, His knife slid through the head's skull as though it was no tougher than butter. Did you have fun playing with my creations? Chapter 482. Aina's body continued to walk forward completely out of her control. Before she could even grasp what was happening, she was sitting to the right of the man, her body trembling uncontrollably. No matter how hard she fought back, she couldn't seem to break free. Aina clenched her jaw, her head raising to look the man in the eye. The situation was far outside of her expectations. She sat no more than 1.5 meters from a man she was certain could take her life with a thought. But what was even more astonishing was the fact this wasn't a man at all. When Aina met the man's gaze, she finally noticed the familiar white irises, flickering with indifference. There was no doubt this was an invalid, a true invalid, a variant invalid. Aina's heart lost control of any sense of rhythm, accelerating to the point it seemed it might fly from her chest at any moment. The man's wrists never stopped, slowly cutting the head before it in half. Grotesque white and red liquid spilled outward, pooling around the severed neck and almost overflowing the plate. Aina's stomach rolled as the invalid brought the fork to its mouth. Somehow, the immaculate table manners it displayed made the scene several times more difficult to watch. The dichotomy of stateliness and stomach-churning sights made one's head spin. No comment. The invalid finished chewing and spoke these words. It wiped its lips with a pristine white cloth despite the fact there wasn't a speck of impurity on its face. It seemed completely at ease. When I sensed that there was someone who had actually chosen to come to me after all these years, I assumed that you would be powerful. But I didn't think that you would be such a fledgling. I guess as the saying goes, the ignorant fear nothing, HM? The invalid smiled lightly. To anyone who didn't know better, it was quite the dazzling smile. All the practice Lionel put in couldn't match to even half the charm the male invalid was currently projecting. Yet Aina only felt more disgust. Unfortunately, as much as she wanted to look away, she couldn't. As for the words the invalid was speaking, Aina didn't spare them much of a thought. She wasn't aware of how dangerous this region was before she entered. Had she would likely understand more of the male invalid's surprise. It had quite literally been centuries since the last time anyone had come to this mountain range willingly, let alone to the point of entering its home and traveling so deeply into its lion's den. The invalid's words suddenly paused, its strong bridged nose tilting up in the air. It took a deep sniff, its gaze stirring with the first hint of emotion Aina had seen from it. This smell? The male invalid leaned forward. Aina fidgeted in her seat, trying to maintain distance, but her movements were completely out of her control. Her body trembled violently even to the point where the chair she sat on almost collapsed. However, it was all meaningless. The nose of the male invalid brushed by Aina's hair and almost touched her neck. It took a pause as though it was appreciating the scent of roses, completely unbothered by Aina's near breakdown. Having an invalid so close, Aina too could smell it. One would have thought that the sensation was akin to being near a rotting corpse, but in Aina's opinion, it was far worse than that. It felt as though she was standing next to a pile of shit. But, upon that pile of shit, one had poured the strongest and most invasive perfumes all over the top of it. It was far worse than just a rotting corpse, far worse than someone trying to replace a shower with deodorant, far worse than any olfactory assault Aina had ever faced before. What a nice scent. The male invalid didn't move from Aina's hair for a long time. It was as though it couldn't sense her squirming in the slightest. It's the scent of a delicacy, the kind of scent that shouldn't appear on this forsaken world. I understand now, you aren't from Terrain, no wonder, no wonder. The male invalid pulled back, but at that moment, Aina's hands began to move against her will. From her sides, they were pulled up until they were pressed palms side down on either side of the plate before her. It was only at that moment that Aina saw what sat in front of her. The brain sat there, its numerous folds slowly collapsing on its own weight. After being exposed to the air for so long, it started to experience some discoloration, turning into a deeper purple black. A pungent smell of blood and gore hung in the air as though trying to suffocate Aina. All the effort she was putting in toward trying to escape made her head swim. The foggier her mind grew, the more the scent seemed to hook into her body, dragging her down toward a bloody abyss. But it was at that moment that Aina's body froze. All her trembling ceased and even her heart seemed to stop beating completely. All of her senses focused on the subtle, soft feeling gliding across her fingers. Aina looked down her hands, her breathing hitching as she watched the male invalid slowly run the flat of its knife against her long, slender fingers. Fear gripped Aina's heart, her teeth rattling out of her control. I've never tasted an otherworlder before. I'm sure you understand. My kind isn't very well accepted. It's a bit sad if you ask me. It's quite amusing though. In every instance of human history, it was the majority that dictated the rules and wielded the power. So, have you ever asked yourself why it was that despite the fact the majority became like us, that we would still have to run and hide like this? It's interesting, don't you think? The male invalid continued to run its knife across Anna's fingers, seemingly enjoying the elasticity her youthful skin showed. Something about the way her skin bent beneath the weight of its knife and rebounded back once the blade moved away was quite mesmerizing to the variant invalid, but it was even more eager to know just what Anna might taste like. Chapter 483. The male invalid smiled lightly, pressing its knife just a bit more firmly into Anna's skin. Despite the fact it was still the flat of the blade, Anna's skin was left with a much deeper impression, taking several more seconds to rebound to its previous unblemished appearance. Anna's jaw clenched tightly, her gaze completely focused on the knife gliding across her hand. It was as though she would rather see everything through to the end than look away. As for the invalid's words, she hardly cared about them. Invalids represented failure. Even if they were the so-called majority, nothing would change that. Plus, unlike humans, invalids couldn't reproduce. They had no way of multiplying their numbers. As such, even if for a short moment they were indeed the majority, just how long would that last exactly? That said, it wasn't like there were no worlds where humans failed to weed out the invalid threat. In those cases, invalids would become the majority and take hold of the planet for themselves. But the irony of it all was that while humans could evolve without invalids, the vice versa was not possible. In the cases where invalids won, the reality was that they in fact lost. Now trapped on a world without humans and without ability to travel to other worlds, they essentially reached their limit until the day the world was devoured by its zones due to lack of human presence. No matter how you looked at it, invalids were inferior in every way. Whether it was by the fact they failed to awaken their abilities or even up to the fact they were reliant on humans even now. Ichem? You don't believe me? The male invalid blinked, a part dangerous, part amused light in its eyes. It seemed impossible to read its intentions, leaving Anna in a perpetually tense state. Her nerves stood on end, even the tiniest hairs on her arms standing erect. This reality quickly chipped away at Anna's mental fortitude. It made one worry if this was the true goal of the invalid all along. You humans have indeed always been like this. But then again, my people have their own issues. I try to tell them that they should control their impulses better, but they don't like to listen. The male invalid sighed, continuing to run its knife across Anna's fingers. They can't blame me for their own foolishness, right? I just turned them all into puppets so they could calm down a bit and bide their time properly. How are we ever going to show the humans who the true superior beings are if we can't do even that? The male invalid chuckled a bit. It looked up from Anna's hand only to find Anna looking toward it, her gaze carrying a fiery blaze. Maybe if looks could kill, the male invalid would have been diced into countless pieces by now. Interesting. The male invalid chuckled more deeply. Your mind is still clear after so long. It's rare for someone to last so long in my presence. Most minds would have collapsed by now. Let me guess, does it have something to do with that crown on your head? The male invalid reached a finger forward, trailing it across Anna's inflamed scars until he stopped at the gem that hung from her forehead. The feeling of having her scars poked and prodded at left Anna's body shaking even more fiercely than before, but her gaze remained defiant. At that moment, the sound of a knife meeting hardwood sounded. Blood flowed slowly, pooling across the table and dripping to the floor. Oops. The male invalid clicked his tongue, shaking his head. He raised his knife back up, carefully cleaning the blood off its blade. After he was finished, he raised the bloodied cloth to his nose, inhaling a deep breath. Anna's fingers rolled from her hand freely, only to be stopped by the male invalid's plate. Veins bulged out from Anna's neck, but her gaze gained a new level of intensity. If only she could move, if only she could just move. This blood. The male invalid closed his eyes. When they opened once more, his gaze had earned a tinge of red. From his previously calm expression, it seemed as though he had lost all reason for a moment. You're a brood mother? The male invalid's face flushed with excitement. He displayed a level of emotion Anna had yet to see to this point. Its laughter rang through the underground space. It was so loud that the walls began to shake. How unexpected. How truly unexpected. Never would I have thought that I would have such a day. For me to meet such a treasure, the heavens are truly smiling down upon me. Ah. The male invalid stood, knocking over its chair and almost shattering the table before it. A towering erection pressed outward against the male invalid's robes and pants. It seemed with each billowing laughter it released, it grew more, becoming almost like a second pulsing monster of its own. When the male invalid's laughter died down, it looked toward Aina with a fervent gaze, the tent in its pants pulsing with a grotesque air. In those moments, the scent the invalid gave off only became more nauseating. Just looking at you, you have no idea the kind of value you have. But I expect humans to wallow in ignorance, so I don't mind explaining it to you. Though the invalid began to speak, Aina's mind was roaring. She wanted to move, she needed to move. She wouldn't be caught here, she wouldn't allow this disgusting creature to do the things it wanted to do to her. She already well knew what a brood mother was. It went by too many names. Birther, Eternal Mother, some even called them vampires. However, there were two things all these titles had in common. The first was that they all guaranteed an impossibly high blood force affinity so high that most talents couldn't even match up to it. Maybe only monsters like Lionel who had grade 9 dream force affinity while still in the third dimension could hope to be on the same level. And the second was that they were among the very few existences that could allow invalids to reproduce. Chapter 484. Aina struggled with all her might. By now, she had a grasp of what the ability of this invalid was. It was clearly a puppeteering ability, and this ability was unfortunately especially effective against those with weak soul forces like her own. However, that didn't mean that she didn't have a chance. She had been struggling from the very beginning. There was simply no way that the stamina of this variant invalid was endless. There had to be a limit to how long it could hold control over her. Due to her experience in the Joan zone, Aina had learned a lot of Joan's death. Even if there was just a single thing the experience taught her, it was that it took far more energy to control a person than it took to wrest control away. Aina knew that all she had to do was to keep struggling, to keep playing the part of helpless damsel. Only then might the invalid foolishly continue to chip away at its own stamina. Do you understand now? Do you understand your worth? Ah. Don't worry, I will treat you well. How couldn't I? You will be the key to my empire, the centerpiece to me truly ruling the universe and showing these humans who the true superior beings are. These fools of terrain seem to believe that they have won the battle against me when the reality is that I am just using them. I have patience that my fellow man do not have. If I didn't have these humans as a cover, how would I continue to enjoy such delicacies every day? Who knows if those invalid hunters would have come to put my head on a pike by now. The male invalid's manic laughter continued to cause the earth to tremble. It was clear at a glance that this invalid was just a step away from the fifth dimension. As for why it hadn't crossed that threshold yet, it simply couldn't. In a world with its potential capped like terrain, it would simply take too long to reach the fifth dimension. Without the ability to travel to other worlds, the invalid could only wait patiently and bide its time. But, so what if terrain reached the fifth dimension eventually? How could the male invalid's ambition end there? Unfortunately, there was nothing it could do. Unless it could find a method to secretly travel to another world without being detected, its path would end here. So, the male invalid had kept its head lowered, displaying patience those of its kind simply didn't have. Of all the things it had spoken, this was by far the closest to the truth. It had indeed displayed exceptional foresight and forbearance. Ah. The name of the puppet master will ring throughout the dimensional verse. At my mere mention, I will ensure that the women shed tears and the men shed blood. I will sunder the clouds with a single word and destroy the earth with a single step. All shall know of my legend. By the end of its speech, the puppet master was practically roaring. Its voice seemed one part ambitious and another part rage-fueled. It was as though all the pent-up frustration of the last several centuries had come bubbling forth. After a long while, the puppet master slowly calmed its raging emotions, its gaze becoming a placid lake of steadiness. With a clap of its hands, the sound of shuffling feet could be heard from the distance. This timing couldn't be more perfect. With all my other chess pieces aligning, this must be a providence of the heavens. I will make my debut into the world soon. But you are still too weak at the moment. If you were to bear my children now, they will be of no help to me. I will first raise your strength, only then will my children be birthed with the most optimal power. At that moment, the puppets brought in an oddly curved package. It was large in stature, so large and likely so heavy that 6 invalids had to carry it in at once. I personally handcrafted this piece, you could call it my magnum opus. The male invalid continued to speak as though it couldn't sense Aina's struggle. I've been nurturing the resources of this mountain range for a long time. You could even say that the most precious herbs and ores of terrain can be found here. But since no one dares to come, it's all mine. The male invalid chuckled as though he felt Aina should be impressed. His demeanor seemed to scream, "What do you think, isn't your future husband wealthy? Be happy." But even compared to those things, this is especially valuable. With another motion, the 6 invalid puppets set the heavy curved package down and opened it up, revealing a cavity filled with pulsing red rubies. If Lionel had been here, his eyes would have immediately widened in shock. These red rubies, each and every one, was as valuable as a quasi-bronze ore. It was known as force-nurturing Oregon. It was an evolution type ore, though less potent than the true evolution Oregon. Its ability wasn't as exaggerated as raising the grade of an ore by a single step. Not only were its effects lesser, it took a long period of time, months to years, for its true worth to come into effect. Usually, force nurturing ore was only useful on already completed products, while evolution ore could be used on raw materials. This was maybe the most important fundamental difference. There was, of course, another benefit to force nurturing ore as well. Not only could it increase the quality of treasures, but it was useful on living beings as well. It had similar recovery benefits to Lionel's cleansing waters, albeit lesser healing effects. At the same time, it could quicken the cultivation of humans and even help herbs to grow faster. Maybe the most shocking part was that the red glow of these tunnels, it was entirely reliant on the source of force-nurturing ore. Just how much of it did this variant invalid have? "I will allow you to sleep in here for a few decades," the puppet master said with a hint of excitement in his voice. "By the time you come out, the foundations of my empire will be set and my new strength will have stabilized. By then, the world will be ours." The puppet master stepped forward, caressing Aina's scars. Somewhat ironically, just like Lionel, Aina's appearance meant little to him. But their reasons vastly differed. A surge of helplessness took hold of Aina's soul. She struggled so hard, yet she couldn't even interrupt this puppet master's psychotic personal soliloquy. Was she really going to die here? Her severed fingers continued to drip blood, coating her hands with a warmth. "I can't die here. I can't die here." A deep unwillingness surged through Aina's body. Her will suddenly pressed again the barrier to the 3rd tier of the 4th dimension. If she could just break through, it would be that much more difficult for this puppet master to control her. A light of hope gripped at Aina's heart. She pushed with all her might, even to the point blood vessels popped in her eyes, causing blood to trickle down her cheeks. A low shout escaped her lips as she rammed against the barrier. The male invalid's eyes widened slightly. Under its control, Aina shouldn't have been able to make a single sound. But at that moment, just when Aina was about to succeed, the burning marks on her face suddenly lit a fire. All the momentum she had vanished, completely destroyed. Chapter 485. Aina felt as though all the wind had been knocked out of her. The faint light of hope she thought she could grasp onto suddenly went up in smoke, disappearing like a fleeting fragrance in the wind. After a moment, the male invalid finally recovered from his shock. That last struggle of Aina's, especially the shout, had actually put a dent in its stamina. Though it wasn't as exaggerated as him being on his last legs, at least a third of his reserves had been sapped up. In truth, Aina's breakthrough wouldn't have made a difference. It was the final act of defiance that truly impacted him. But it seemed that this final push had truly taken whatever she had left out. When the puppet master recovered, its gaze narrowed, a slight hint of ferocity hidden within their depths. "It seems that you don't understand how to be grateful, what a shame." The male invalid reached up from Aina's cheek, ripping the crown from her head. "Oh." At that moment, the control the male invalid had on Aina increased by more than tenfold. Whereas Aina could at least struggle and resist before, right now, she couldn't even breathe without the invalid's permission. "So that's how it is. Clever, clever. You diverted some of your mental strength into hiding the grade of this treasure from me so that you could struggle in secret. I thought that your mental strength was nothing compared to me to begin with, but to think it was even worse than I originally believed." The invalid examined the headpiece closer. After a moment it began to laugh again. "A quasi-bronze treasure? And one that boosts mental strength as well? You are truly my guardian angel." The invalid's laughter seemed even more uproarious than before. But it only made sense. Such a treasure to a mental strength expert like him would be like giving wings to a tiger. It already allowed someone with such poor soul force like Aina to struggle against a near fifth-dimensional entity like it. What kind of amplification effects would it have on him? Without hesitation, the invalid slipped the headpiece onto its head. Though it was somewhat feminine, it was already clear that appearances were something it could care less about. Whereas the benefits of using Aina like a sow would take decades, even centuries to begin to bear fruit, the benefit of a quasi-bronze treasure would give its coming plans an almost 100% chance of succeeding. If the invalid was certain that the heavens were smiling down on it before, it was convinced without a shadow of a doubt now. Yes, yes, yes. The invalid felt as though the whole world had opened up to it. The restrictions on Aina became even sturdier. It was to the point it could even manipulate Aina's senses to make her see what it wanted her to see. The male invalid looked down at Aina. By now its erection had calmed. It looked toward the girl before it like a prime steak on a cutting board. It's a shame that you aren't obedient. But this is fine, I will teach you obedience. The invalid picked up the knife on the table and spun it in the air, allowing to fall as it pleased. The sound of a blade embedding itself into wood sounded again. But this time, it had severed the fingers from Aina's other hand. Aina couldn't even flinch. Pain racked her body, threatening to throw her into the pits of hell. It felt as though everything revolved around the torture she was experiencing. The invalid forced Aina's head to turn toward it as it picked up one of her fingers, sniffing at the dripping blood as an intoxicated look surfaced across its face. Its tongue swept across the crimson liquid falling from its hand. Oh my! The rested erection of the invalid came back, soaring to towering heights even past where it had been before. Magnificent. Wonderful. Unbelievable. The invalid could no longer hold itself back. Its teeth shone beneath the crimson lights as it bit down. The sound of crunching bones shook Aina to her soul. She sat there and watched as her finger was eaten before her. The fear, the helplessness, the despair. It swarmed around her like inner devils looking to devour all sense of pride and hope she had left. I can't die here. I can't die. Aina continued to roar these words in her mind, the tears of blood continuously streaming down her face. But it simply didn't seem to matter what she thought at all. How could there be such a delicacy in this world? Magnifique. Aina sat immobile, the haunting thoughts eating at her mind. Would she really die here? But what about her mother? What about her revenge? What about the Brazinger family? A bitterness took root in her chest. The flash of a young man's smile suddenly occupied her mind. Though it was less charming than that of the invalids, to Aina, it was several times better. She didn't know how much effort the young man put into that smile, but just by gazing upon it, it felt as though she could see through all its sincerity, all its meaning. Other than the smile, though, she couldn't quite see the rest of the young man's face. Her mind was tired, her heart was tired. I can't die here? At that moment, the male invalid suddenly frowned. Before he realized what was happening, he had already swallowed 4 of Aina's fingers, each tasting better than the last. There's fifth-dimensional blood within your veins? The male invalid shook his head. How impressive. It will be a bit troublesome to get rid of it, but with my strength it won't be a problem. In fact, it will only strengthen my body in the end. Compared to Aina, the puppet master was much closer to the 5th dimension. It of course wouldn't be a problem for him to deal with such a faint trace of the abyssal panther blood. After all, Aina had already absorbed most of it. But, in that instant, the male invalid suddenly grabbed his stomach and coughed. Ichem? A cough? He had no reason to be coughing. A heat suddenly spread throughout the invalid's body. The more seconds ticked by, the hotter its body seemed to become. The invalid's eyes suddenly widened, its vision blurring. A curse? Shackles lashed out at the invalid, spreading through its body like a virus. At that moment, Aina finally felt the restrictions on her loosen. A year later, Aina slowly rose up from her position, her hand reaching out toward the curved package by her side. It trembled and opened, revealing the form of a massive golden red axe, pulsing with a blinding red light. Blood. Her soft voice traveled to the ears of everyone on the battlefield once again. Chapter 486. A maleficent aura enveloped the battlefield. It felt as though a crimson tide was washing over them all, but instead of carrying the characteristic warmth and thickness of blood, it was instead cold and lifeless, seeping into their pores and causing their hearts to quake. Aina slowly walked from the military tent, its flaps making way for her. Somehow, despite her petite body, she became the center of the entire battlefield. Even City Lord White, who was in the midst of sending a final death blow toward Lancelot, paused, an eerie look in her eye locking onto Aina as well. Aina's footsteps halted. The scars that danced across her face seemed to come to life, raging about like living, breathing flood dragons. They grew a size, radiating out with a heat that made the temperature of the battlefield skyrocket. The momentum she had walked out with seemed to dim somewhat. Though the hold she held over the battlefield didn't vanish, it snapped City Lord White out of her stupor. And very quickly what once was her absent-mindedness became her shock. How could such a thing happen to her? How did she lose control of her thoughts for a moment? Why did she feel fear just now? Aina's delicate brows furrowed, her gaze still somewhat vacant. Go away! The scars on Aina's face grew more fervent as though insulted by Aina's words. They bulged out another fold in size. By now it was almost impossible to see what should have been a young girl's face. The swelling became so bad that healthy skin became impossible to spot. I said, go away. Aina's delicate voice boomed across the battlefield, carrying such compulsion that many of the warriors on it turned tailed and ran. No, they weren't running. They were following Aina's orders. At that very instant, a mental strength that superseded worlds covered the battlefield. It was simply impossible to grasp that someone with such weak talent in this area could possibly display such might. However, any thoughts one would have spared to this instantly vanished with the next sight. The scars on Aina's face struggled and rose, finally showing their true appearance. They squirmed like grotesque leeches, wielding their circular mouths and several rows of teeth as though trying to devour Aina right then and there. But it was in that moment that Aina's overwhelming mental strength shook them to their core. As though feeling a fear they never had before, they retreated, disappearing into Aina's face like they had never been there. However, it was the sight that was left behind that silenced the battlefield. Beautiful. Too beautiful. Beautiful to the point it seemed impossible to have such a being in the possession of a human. It must have been a fairy, a fae, a goddess. The moment the vile leeches vanished, a restriction placed on Aina's body seemed to disappear as well. She grew half a foot in height, quickly soaring past 6 feet and rivaling even Mordred. Her legs became long and slender as her figure filled out completely. The curves that had once been so well hidden by her black military uniform couldn't seem to hide any longer as her clothing grew. Aina's hair lengthened. From the small of her back, it almost fell to the ground, shimmering with a healthy luster. Her amber eyes became warmer, exuding a soft golden color that compelled one to stare indefinitely yet somehow make them want to look away just as much. Even with all of these changes, the largest of them couldn't be denied. Without her scars, Aina's visage had become more precious than the most delicate of carvings. Her supple skin, the gentle slopes of her jaw and nose, the elegant arches of her brow. Her every action, no matter how mundane, no matter how indifferent, exuded a charm that only creatures of myths and legend could match. Aina's delicate brow furrowed. At that moment, her frustration seemed to become everyone's frustration. All those who laid eyes on her wanted to know what was bothering her. She just had to say the word and they would fight to the ends of the earth to get rid of it. Aina's chest moved and seemed to flex slightly. The sound of tearing fabric sounded, making the hearts of all those watching lose track of their breaths for a moment. But oddly enough, there was no change to Aina's military uniform in the slightest. No change except for her figure seemingly becoming a size fuller. She reached her slender fingers into her collar and pulled out a long white cloth that had once bound her chest, throwing it onto the ground. Aina, seemingly finally feeling comfortable, swung out casually with her axe. An invisible, piercing wind shot across the ground, elevating a piece of earth and blasting it apart. Aina looked up, her gaze locking onto City Lord White. This was the she-devil that had brought her out here. She had the blood she wanted so badly. Aina finally began to walk forward. Her every step seemed soft, but webs of cracked land followed her gait. Each time she raised a foot, she crossed tens of meters in a blink. Yet, her every action was so enticing, so hypnotic, that City Lord White didn't even sense danger until Aina was already just 10 meters away. To experts on their level, this might as well have been a single arm's length. Aina raised her axe. At that moment, it felt as though the whole world had raised it along with her. The winds followed her will, the clouds split just so that the stars could watch her, the energies of the universe stilled and calmed. City Lord White only seemed to awaken again when that dense killing intent locked onto her. The instinct she had trained for decades shocked her still heart into action. Her face flushed, shock and fear written all over it. This sort of suppression was something she had never faced before in her life. She couldn't comprehend just what was happening. But she already had no more time to think about it as Aina's blade began to descend. Chapter 487. Fairyliss watched as her warriors fell one after another, a hint of shock coloring her gaze. The warriors of White City had long since been indifferent to high casualties. The truth was that one of the strategies Terrain had prepared before launching this attack was precisely this. It had to be remembered that Earth had lost more than 99% of its population. As a result, even if Earth had a higher concentration of talents, what could they do if Terrain sent wave after wave of warriors after them? This was precisely why City Lord White didn't care about using the death of her men to stall. Compared to Earth's remaining population of barely a few million, Terrain City Lords had access to population in the billions and fighters numbering in the tens of millions. Though only a fraction of these were elites, it hardly mattered if Terrain could just throw such numbers out continuously to wear Earth down. However, the group Fairyliss was heading was far different. These men with her were the true elites of White City. Not only did they have 10 White Knights with them, but a large number of the soldiers beneath them were just a step away from this title. In fact, there were many candidates to replace White Knight Dior among them. Unfortunately, no matter how elite they were, how could they make do without their force? Fairyliss was completely caught off guard. According to her information, force disruption towers should have lost their effect after Earth entered the fourth dimension. So what was going on? No, that's not right. Even the most elite of force disruption towers should only have an effective range of a few hundred meters. But I don't sense any towers in the vicinity. At that moment, Krakos raised his saber and attacked Fairyliss once more. The White Knight could only grit her teeth and parry, her feet sliding several meters before coming to a grinding halt. It really is the weapon. Fairyliss was at a loss. When had Earth gained such technology? It can't be that Earth already researched the fourth dimension? But that didn't make any sense. Crossing the dimensional barrier should have been the equivalent of Earth getting sent back to the Stone Ages. It took thousands of years for Earth to reach the technological advancements they had within the third dimension despite their talent. It should take the same amount of effort to reach such a height in the fourth dimension. This was why most worlds, even when they had comprehended the sciences to a high degree, would choose to abandon it entirely after undergoing their first metamorphosis. If a world took several thousand years to stabilize themselves every time they evolved to a new dimension, how could it possibly protect itself? As a result, these worlds had no choice but to rely on the well-established disciplines of the dimensional verse. Only these well-tested and well-known professions that had withstood the test of time could be trusted. Unless... Fairyliss trembled. Could it be that Earth had a force crafter? The possibility shook Fairyliss to her core. In fact, she found it even harder to believe than Earth managing to adapt their technology to the fourth dimension. It had to be known that Terrain had not a single force crafter. Of course, things weren't so exaggerated. There were plenty of petty force crafter apprentices who thought to flaunt themselves on weak worlds like theirs. However, even the best of these could only craft Tier 3 black treasures at best. This shouldn't be looked down upon though. Unfortunately, due to such constraints, most of their warriors were outfitted with such weapons. But to put things into perspective, wielding a Tier 3 black treasure at their current strength was like a soldier of Earth's 21st century choosing a butter knife as his preferred weapon. Force crafters, as in ones that could actually sway a war of this level, were existences even City Lord White would have to be respectful to. Such existences wouldn't be caught dead on a world like Terrain and wouldn't have a reason to come to Earth just yet because such a fledgling world, despite its talent, simply couldn't afford to compensate them. Someone like Lionel who didn't quite understand the full scope of the dimensional verse would still be in the dark about these matters, but Fairyliss who had seen much of the world most definitely wouldn't have been. Those who had talents to become force crafters were 1 in a billion, and that was only if one took the aggregate of all worlds, both talented and untalented. If one were to look at a world like Terrain, despite their population of tens of billions, it would be impossible to find even one such talent. The threshold one needed to reach in internal sight was too high. One only needed a smidgen of internal sight talent to cultivate force. But, in order to become a crafter, one would need to, at the very least, be capable of forming 1 star of Lionel's 3-star constitution. As though this wasn't enough to prove the rarity, just having the talent wasn't even the minimum threshold one needed to meet. Why would a force crafter easily divulge the secrets of his or her crafts? Why would they disseminate their techniques and the product of their years of research without a price? One with talent might have the capability to become a crafter, but whether one would truly be able to succeed would be dependent on whether you had the connections to learn what it is one would need to. The more Fariolus thought about it, the stronger her clashes with Krakos became, the more blood leaked from her lips, the more confused she seemed to become. It was impossible. It shouldn't be possible. How could Earth have such a thing? They must have traded for these weapons with their zone rewards. Yes, that must be it. That had to be it. Though Fariolus thought this far, she knew her attempts at calming her heart were just foolish. How could Camelot, who just became a part of Earth, have had time to clear enough zones to gather so many weapons? A sharp pain shot through Fariolus's chest. She looked down, stunned, before looking up toward Krakos with a defiant glare. Unfortunately, unlike the rest of her counterparts, the facade of White City cracked just a margin with her. Behind that gaze, the roots of despair had already sunk their claws in. Chapter 488. Lionel watched all of this coldly from the distance. Even until their deaths, those white knights would have no idea that they had dug their own graves. The weapons Lionel had outfitted the demons with were very special. Each of them had a beast crystal at the core of the center of their design. When Lionel came across the predator ravens, he knew that he had gained a massive chance to turn the tide of this war. The force disruption abilities of the predator ravens was actually quite weak. As a result, they could only interrupt force-based techniques that relied heavily on order and organization. And even then, if they ran into someone like Lionel whose internal sight was exceptionally strong, it would be an issue to interrupt him at all unless they had a large numbers advantage. This only made sense. Terrain was a world of weak talent, so how could the beast that called it home be too powerful? They were very limited in the impact they could have, and this was only right. However, this was where Lionel could step in. Using the force disruption of the predator ravens as the base, he amplified it to the greatest degree he could. The ability of the predator ravens was ultimately a soul-type ability. Using this knowledge, Lionel combined it with a familiar or the Tier 8 Black Grade or Howling Tiger. Lionel had come across this or during his time in the Hive. In fact, he had even thought of making it a part of his divine armor at one point. At least, that was until he ran into a stronger domain-type Oregon. Howling Tiger was a domain soul-type Oregon. It could assault one's mind, wild fluctuation of soul force that manifested like a roaring tiger. This was an exceptionally valuable ore as made obvious by its Tier 8 status. But Lionel didn't need the effects to be so powerful. In addition, even if Lionel wanted the maximum effect, he would need enough or to infuse the full essence into every weapon. If one did the calculations for just how much such a thing would cost, even the greatest tycoons of fourth-dimensional worlds would begin to feel the squeeze. Instead of doing this, Lionel just needed to incorporate a small sliver of Howling Tiger ore into each weapon, thus using its howling effect to amplify the force disruption ability of the weapons the demons wielded. When these weapons were used, a warrior would essentially have a small domain of about 2 meters around themselves where force within the standard of the fourth dimension became absolutely useless. That said, there was one glaring weakness of these treasures. While it impacted one's opponents, it was unfortunately subject to friendly fire. Not only would this treasure stop comrades from using force, even the wielder of the weapon itself would be unable to use force in the slightest. Other than pouring in force directly from one's body and into the weapon to sustain the domain, it was impossible to do anything else force-related. Due to such a striking weakness, this weapon would never be used by most people. The trade-off simply wouldn't be worth it for many warriors. Force was the foundation of too many abilities. Without it, it would be like tying one's hands behind one's back. But the demons were different. They were especially known for their physiques. Compared to humans, they were several times more powerful in this aspect. In addition, while the warriors of Terrain had become used to battling with their abilities and force, the demons of Camelot had long since been used to battling without such advantages. On top of this, demons were larger and heavier. Without force, it was difficult to even begin to take them down. In the end, such weapons were absolutely perfect for a demon army. Lionel's actions were practically like giving wings to a tiger. At that moment, Lionel turned his attention to the platform flying over the mountain range. They were likely still unaware that their people were being massacred. But Lionel had no intention of sparing them in the slightest. Lionel waved a hand, causing a line of crossbows to appear. Chain domain. One might wonder how a world without force crafters like Terrain could build siege weapons as powerful as these crossbows. But the answer was simple: over-engineering. Over-engineering was a concept in the field of engineers to point out excess. Sometimes it was done on purpose in order to ensure a structure would never fail. But, at other times, this excess often became the representation of a waste of resources. In the second case, over-engineering was usually the folly of those without experience or understanding. It would be like building a bridge of diamond just because diamond was a very strong stone rather than the much less expensive steel. Only a fool would do such a thing. In order to make up for their lack of skill, Terrain overcompensated with the materials they used. The pulley structure of the crossbows were built with unrefined Tier 7 ores and pulled with the tendons of Tier 7 and 8 beasts. In the end, the crossbows were incredibly inconvenient to use. Not only was it almost impossible to aim, but just loading it took the strength of a warrior that would be much better served on the battlefield. And, as much of a waste as the crossbows themselves were, the bolts they used were an even sadder case. Lionel didn't even want to think about it. However, now that these crossbows were in Lionel's possession, how could they possibly still have the same weaknesses? The eyes of the scout on the back of the floating platform widened, partly in shock and partly in confusion. He recognized the crossbows well. It was simply impossible for anyone without the strength of a Tier 5 warrior to load them. And even such an existence would have to use all their strength in several minutes. Just what could this young man do with 500 crossbows lined up like that? Still, the scout didn't take any chances. Raise the defenses. Strong fluctuations of force surged. Soon, the floating platform, carried by numerous flying beasts, was covered in a thick, illusory shield. Lionel watched this scene emotionlessly, his chain domain slowly winding the pulleys of the crossbows and slightly shifting their aims one after another. With one Predator Raven Beast crystal, Lionel was able to make 10 weapons. However, there were only 2,000 or so demons fighting below. So what did he do with the rest? Lionel's cold gaze remained locked onto the platform. His black robes whipped about in the harsh winds. So high up, the air was not only cold, but it was violent and sharp. The atmosphere seemed quite appropriate. With a thought, Lionel fired all 500 crossbows at once. In those moments, it felt as though the sky might collapse at any moment. Blood. Sovereign. City Lord White struggled to breathe. But, with Aina's slender hands clasping her throat, her brain hardly got any flow of blood, let alone her lungs being satiated by oxygen. Aina's indifferent gaze looked into City Lord White's demonic eyes. And then the sound of breaking bones resounded. City Lord White's defiant gaze remained locked onto Aina, but any light it once held had long since faded. Aina inhaled. Under the astonished gazes of the silent battlefield, a torrent of blood manifested from the dead City Lord White, entering her mouth. Author's note below: December 23, 21. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.